On May 15, 1930, 2-year-old Mary Agnes Moroney vanished from her Chicago home, taken by a well-dressed woman calling herself Julia Otis. 93 years later, DNA genealogy finally revealed what happened. Mary Agnes lived a full life just 11 miles from her desperate parents, dying in 2003 as Jeanette Burchard, never knowing her true identity. This case represents the oldest solved kidnapping in Chicago Missing Persons Bureau history and demonstrates the revolutionary power of genetic genealogy to close cases that conventional investigation could not crack. To understand how a child could be stolen in broad daylight from her own mother, we must first understand the world the Moroney family inhabited. The year was 1930. America had plunged into the Great Depression just months earlier, following the catastrophic stock market crash of October 1929. In Chicago, the economic devastation would eventually leave half the city unemployed by 1933. But even in those earliest months of the Depression, the Moroney family was already drowning. Michael J. Moroney was born in 1899, making him 31 years old when his daughter disappeared. He worked passing out handbills on the streets of Chicago, earning just $15 per week. In today's money, accounting for inflation, that's roughly $260 per week, or about $13,500 per year. It was barely enough to keep his family from starvation. His wife Catherine had been born Catherine Rooney in 1912. Her life had been hard from the very beginning. When she married Michael, she was only 13 years old. He was 26. By the time she reached 17, just 4 years after her marriage, Catherine had already given birth to 2 children and was pregnant with her third. She was still a teenager, but her youth had been stolen by poverty, childbirth, and endless work. The Moroney family lived on the second floor of a building at 5200 South Wentworth Avenue, on Chicago's South Side. The neighborhood was working class, filled with immigrants and their children, all struggling to survive. Catherine spent her days scrubbing floors in their small apartment while caring for 2-year-old Mary Agnes and 11-month-old Anastasia. Her swollen belly carried their third child. There was no money for help, no money for childcare, no money for anything beyond the bare necessities. Michael's job passing out handbills meant long hours on the street in all kinds of weather. He would leave early in the morning and return late in the evening, exhausted, his pockets containing whatever meager wages he'd earned that day. Catherine was alone with the children for most of every day, isolated in their second-floor apartment, trying to make their small income stretch to cover rent, food, and the basic needs of 2 small children with another on the way. The Moroney's poverty made them vulnerable in ways they couldn't have imagined. When you're desperate, when you can't afford food or rent, when you're watching your children go hungry, you'll accept help from almost anyone. And there were people watching families like the Moroneys. People who understood that desperation and who knew how to exploit it. A relative of the Moroneys, someone trying to help, wrote a letter to a social services column in one of Chicago's newspapers. The letter described the family's dire circumstances: the pregnant teenage mother, the 2 babies, the father earning $15 a week, the desperate need for assistance. The person who wrote the letter was trying to help. They thought that by bringing attention to the family's situation, perhaps some charity or social service organization would step in. But the newspaper made what investigators would later call a slip. When they published the letter in their social services column, they included the Moroney family's address, 5200 South Wentworth Avenue. It was meant to help. Instead, it sealed Mary Agnes Moroney's fate. Somewhere in Chicago, a woman was reading that newspaper column. She was looking for families in crisis. Families so desperate they might not ask too many questions. Families who could be manipulated. When she saw the Moroney family's address published in black and white, she knew exactly what to do. On Wednesday, May 14, 1930, Catherine Moroney was on her hands and knees, scrubbing the floor of their small apartment. Her pregnancy made the work even harder, but the floors had to be cleaned, the children had to be fed and watched, and there was no one else to do it. Mary Agnes, just 5 days past her 2nd birthday, played nearby. Baby Anastasia was likely napping or being kept entertained by her older sister. Then came a knock at the door. Catherine struggled to her feet, wiping her wet, reddened hands on her apron. When she opened the door, she found a well-dressed woman standing in the hallway, smiling warmly at her. The contrast between Catherine and her visitor couldn't have been more striking. Catherine was young but worn down, her hands rough from constant work, her dress simple and worn, her face showing the strain of poverty and pregnancy. The woman at her door looked like she belonged in a different world entirely. Later, witnesses would describe the woman who called herself Julia Otis in detail. She appeared to be around 22 or 23 years old, though she might have been older. She stood about 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighed approximately 125 pounds. She had a slender build and protruding teeth that became noticeable when she smiled. But what struck people most was her voice. She spoke with what witnesses called a cultured accent, suggesting education and social class far above the working-class neighborhood where the Moroneys lived. Her clothing reinforced that impression of wealth and status. She wore a gray suit with blue trimmings, tailored and expensive-looking. On her head sat a fashionable lace hat. Around her neck hung a pearl necklace, and on her wrist gleamed a jeweled wristwatch. In 1930, at the beginning of the Great Depression, such items marked her as either wealthy or someone who wanted to appear wealthy. To Catherine Moroney, scrubbing floors while pregnant and caring for 2 babies, this woman must have seemed like she'd stepped out of a magazine. Julia Otis introduced herself with confidence and warmth. She explained that she'd been sent by a social worker named Mrs. Henderson. She'd read about the Moroney family's situation and wanted to help. The story was plausible enough. Social workers did visit poor families, charitable organizations did try to provide assistance, and the Moroneys desperately needed help. Otis stepped into the apartment and looked around with what seemed like genuine sympathy. She saw Catherine's work-worn hands, the sparse furniture, the signs of poverty everywhere. She expressed concern for Catherine's health, for her pregnancy, for the burden of caring for 2 small children in such difficult circumstances. She listened as Catherine talked about their struggles, about Michael's low wages, about trying to make ends meet. Then Julia Otis made her offer. She told Catherine that she could take Mary Agnes to California for a while. The child would be well cared for, she promised. She would be dressed in beautiful clothes, fed the finest foods, given everything a small child could want. And when the family's circumstances improved, when Catherine had recovered from childbirth and was back on her feet, Mary Agnes would return, fat as a butterball. The child would come back healthy and happy, and in the meantime, Catherine would have 1 less mouth to feed and 1 less child to care for while dealing with her pregnancy and baby Anastasia. Catherine Moroney said no. Despite her desperate circumstances, despite the offer of help from this well-dressed, cultured woman, Catherine's maternal instincts warned her against it. She thanked Julia Otis but firmly declined the offer. Mary Agnes would stay with her family. Julia Otis didn't argue. She didn't push. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out $2, pressing the money into Catherine's hand. In 1930, $2 was a significant amount of money for a family living on $15 a week. It was more than 13% of their weekly income, handed over by a stranger. Otis told Catherine to use it for the children, promised she would return to check on the family, and left. Catherine must have felt relieved when the door closed behind Julia Otis. She'd stood firm. She'd protected her daughter. The $2 would help buy food. Maybe that was the end of it. It wasn't. The next day was Thursday, May 15th, 1930. Just 24 hours had passed since Julia Otis's first visit. Just 5 days had passed since Mary Agnes Moroney's second birthday on May 10th. It was an ordinary spring day in Chicago, neither particularly warm nor cold, just another day of Catherine trying to keep her household running on next to nothing while Michael was out distributing handbills. Julia Otis returned. When Catherine opened the door, she found the same well-dressed woman standing there, smiling warmly. This time, Otis carried packages. She'd brought baby clothes for Catherine's pregnancy, practical gifts that the family couldn't afford to buy themselves. Catherine must have felt both grateful and perhaps a bit guilty for her suspicions the day before. Here was this kind woman, returning as promised, bringing gifts. Then Julia Otis shared exciting news. She claimed she had found a better job for Michael. She had connections, she explained, and she'd use them to arrange for Michael to get work that would pay more than his current $15 a week. The family's financial troubles would soon be over. She just needed to discuss some details with him. But there was one more thing. Julia Otis asked if she could take Mary Agnes to a nearby store to buy the child some new clothes and shoes. Just a quick trip to the local shops, she explained. The little girl needed proper clothing, and Otis wanted to help. They would be back soon. Catherine hesitated. The same maternal instinct that had made her refuse the California offer the day before was warning her again. But this was different, wasn't it? This wasn't about sending Mary Agnes away to California for weeks or months. This was just a quick shopping trip to a nearby store. They'd be back in an hour or two, and Julia Otis had just brought baby clothes, had arranged a better job for Michael. She was helping them. Catherine agreed. What happened next would haunt the Moroney family for 93 years. Mary Agnes Moroney did not want to go with Julia Otis. The 2-year-old began crying immediately. According to family accounts preserved in later newspaper reports and police records, Mary Agnes was having a fit. The toddler did not want to go. She sobbed and struggled, her small body rigid with fear or simply the natural resistance of a young child who didn't want to leave her mother. Children often sense danger that adults miss. Mary Agnes had never met this woman before yesterday. She didn't know her, didn't trust her, and didn't want to go with her. Her instincts were screaming at her to stay with her mother. She cried and fought, but she was only 2 years old and weighed perhaps 25 or 30 pounds. She had no power to resist an adult. Julia Otis took her anyway. Catherine Moroney watched as the well-dressed woman carried her sobbing daughter out the door and down the stairs. She must have heard Mary Agnes crying as they left the building. The sound of her daughter's distress probably echoed in the stairwell. Catherine had no way of knowing that she would never see Mary Agnes again. The hours passed. Afternoon turned to evening. Michael Moroney came home from his day of passing out handbills on the Chicago streets, expecting to find his family as he'd left them that morning. Instead, he found Catherine increasingly frantic with worry. Mary Agnes hadn't returned. Julia Otis hadn't brought her back. They waited a bit longer, hoping maybe the shopping trip had taken longer than expected. But as evening deepened into night, and their 2-year-old daughter still hadn't come home, the terrible truth began to dawn on them. Mary Agnes was gone. The woman who called herself Julia Otis had taken her. Catherine and Michael called the police. The Chicago Police Department responded quickly. In 1930, kidnapping cases were taken seriously, even if the victim was the child of a poor immigrant family, rather than a wealthy family that could offer a large reward. Officers arrived at the Moroney apartment and took statements from Catherine and Michael, getting every detail they could about Julia Otis. Her appearance, her clothing, what she'd said, when she'd come, everything. Catherine described the woman in as much detail as she could remember. 5 feet 2 inches tall, about 125 pounds, around 22 or 23 years old, protruding teeth, a cultured, educated voice, gray suit with blue trimmings, lace hat, pearl necklace, jeweled wristwatch. The police took careful notes, knowing these details would be crucial in tracking down the kidnapper. The investigation moved quickly in those first hours. Based on Julia Otis's claim that she planned to take Mary Agnes to California, police immediately began checking buses and trains heading west. They scoured Union Station, one of Chicago's major train terminals, showing photographs of Mary Agnes to ticket agents, conductors, and passengers. They checked other transportation hubs throughout the city. They contacted police departments in cities along the route to California, asking them to watch for a well-dressed woman traveling with a small blonde child. One early lead seemed promising. A witness reported seeing a woman matching Julia Otis's description in the restroom of a downtown department store. According to the witness, the woman was dictating a letter to an older woman while a small child sat nearby. The description of the child matched Mary Agnes. Police rushed to the location, but by the time they arrived, the women and child were gone. Whether it had actually been Julia Otis, Mary Agnes, and some accomplice, or just a coincidence of similar-looking people, was never determined. On May 19, 1930, just 4 days after the kidnapping, Catherine Moroney went before a judge and obtained a formal kidnapping warrant charging Julia Otis. This legal action meant that Julia Otis could now be arrested on sight by any law enforcement officer anywhere in the United States. Wanted notices went out to police departments across the country, all describing the well-dressed woman with protruding teeth and a cultured voice who had stolen a 2-year-old girl from her mother. But Julia Otis had vanished completely. No one could find her. And in 1930, that wasn't surprising. This was before the FBI had jurisdiction over kidnapping cases. This was before computerized databases could track people across state lines. This was before surveillance cameras recorded everyone's movements. This was before credit cards left paper trails of purchases. If someone wanted to disappear in 1930, especially someone with money and planning, it was remarkably easy to do so. Then the letters arrived. The first letter came postmarked May 16, 1930, just 1 day after the kidnapping. Catherine Moroney's hands must have trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in neat, educated handwriting. It was signed Julia Otis. The letter read, "Please don't be alarmed. I have taken your little girl to California with me. I have hired a special nurse to care for her. We'll be back in 2 months. By that time you will be on your feet again and will be able to care for her." She didn't even cry a bit. She is outfitted like a princess. Along with the letter was money. Julia Otis had included cash in the envelope, perhaps to ease the Moroneys' financial burden, perhaps to ease her own guilt, perhaps to maintain the pretense that she really did intend to return Mary Agnes in 2 months as promised. The letter was both a relief and a horror. On one hand, it suggested Mary Agnes was alive and being cared for. The mention of a special nurse and the child being outfitted like a princess implied she was in good conditions. But the letter also confirmed what Catherine already knew in her heart. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a delay. Julia Otis had deliberately kidnapped Mary Agnes and had taken her to California, far from her family. The claim that Mary Agnes didn't even cry a bit was a lie. Catherine knew it was a lie. She'd heard her daughter sobbing as Julia Otis carried her away. She'd seen Mary Agnes's distress, heard her cries. This lie in the letter made everything else suspect. If Julia Otis would lie about something Catherine knew to be false, what else in the letter was false? Would Mary Agnes really be returned in 2 months? Was she really being cared for by a nurse? Was she really in California at all? Catherine and Michael gave the letter to police, who analyzed it carefully. The handwriting was neat and educated, consistent with Julia Otis's cultured speech. The postmark showed it had been mailed from Chicago on May 16th, which meant Julia Otis had written it either late on May 15th, after kidnapping Mary Agnes, or early the next morning. Had she really left for California? Or was that another lie? A second letter arrived about 2 weeks later, around May 29th or May 30th. Catherine again opened it with trembling hands. This time, the letter was signed Alice Henderson. The writer claimed to be Julia Otis's cousin and wanted to explain what had happened. According to this letter, Julia Otis had suffered terrible tragedies the previous year. Her husband had died, and her baby had died as well. The double loss had triggered a severe nervous breakdown. Julia Otis was love-hungry, desperate for a child to replace the baby she'd lost. She'd seen the newspaper article about the Moroney family and couldn't help herself. She'd taken Mary Agnes not to harm her, but because she was mentally ill and desperate to fill the void in her life. The letter from Alice Henderson included a postscript mentioning that Mary Agnes had developed a minor cold but was being well cared for. The message was clearly meant to reassure the Moroneys that their daughter was alive, healthy, and would be returned once Julia Otis recovered from her breakdown. Police examined the second letter carefully and made a crucial discovery. The handwriting in the letter signed Alice Henderson was identical to the handwriting in the letter signed Julia Otis. There was no Alice Henderson, there was no cousin. Julia Otis had written both letters herself, inventing the cousin as a way to provide a sympathetic explanation for the kidnapping while maintaining the fiction that Mary Agnes would eventually be returned. The letters told the police several important things. First, Julia Otis was educated and intelligent. She wrote well, with proper grammar and spelling. Second, she was trying to maintain some kind of relationship or communication with the Moroney family, which was unusual for kidnappers. Third, she was either genuinely mentally ill or pretending to be as a way to generate sympathy. Fourth, and most ominously, she had gone to the trouble of inventing a fictional cousin to provide a cover story, which suggested a level of calculation and planning that contradicted the image of a mentally ill woman acting impulsively. But the letters, for all the information they provided, didn't help police find Mary Agnes. The postmarks were from Chicago, suggesting Julia Otis might not have actually gone to California at all. Or she might have returned to mail the letters before leaving again. There was no return address, no clues about where she was staying, nothing that could help track her down. Catherine and Michael clung to one hope, the promise that Mary Agnes would be returned in 2 months. 2 months from May 15th would be mid-July. They waited, hoping against hope that Julia Otis would keep her word. She didn't. July came and went. No Mary Agnes, no Julia Otis, no more letters. The Chicago Police Department continued investigating, but leads were scarce. They had questioned neighbors, searched records, followed up on every tip that came in, but Julia Otis had vanished as completely as Mary Agnes. The investigation was hampered by the limitations of 1930 law enforcement. There were no computers to search for matching names in other jurisdictions. There were no facial recognition systems. There were no national databases of criminals. What the police had were paper records, telephone calls, telegrams, and the hope that someone, somewhere, had seen something. The Moroneys' lives had been shattered. Michael still went out every day to distribute handbills, earning his $15 a week, but his mind was on his missing daughter. Catherine, now in the late stages of her pregnancy, was consumed with grief and guilt. She blamed herself for letting Mary Agnes go with Julia Otis. She replayed that moment over and over in her mind. If only she'd said no again. If only she'd insisted on going along to the store. If only she'd listened to Mary Agnes's cries and refused to let the woman take her. In the summer of 1930, Catherine gave birth to her third child. But the joy that should have accompanied a new baby was overshadowed by the absence of Mary Agnes. Every time Catherine looked at her newborn, she thought of the 2-year-old who should have been there, who should have been meeting her new sibling, who should have been part of their family. The investigation continued through the summer and into the fall. Tips came in sporadically. There were reported sightings of children who might be Mary Agnes in various cities across the country. Police checked each one. None turned out to be the missing Moroney child. As 1930 became 1931, and then 1932, the case began to go cold. There were no new leads. Julia Otis had left no trace. Mary Agnes had vanished completely. The police continued to keep the case open, continued to follow up on tips when they came in, but there was less and less to investigate. The trail had gone completely cold. In July of 1931, more than a year after Mary Agnes disappeared, police in Rockford, Illinois, made a discovery that briefly reignited hope. Officers found an elderly Native American woman named Martha Thompson pushing a cart through the streets. In the cart sat a blonde, blue-eyed child approximately 3 years old. The discovery was reported to Chicago police because the child roughly matched the description of Mary Agnes Moroney. The timing fit. Mary Agnes would have been about 3 years old by then. The physical description matched: blonde hair, blue eyes. The circumstances were suspicious. An elderly woman with a young child she claimed wasn't hers. When questioned, Martha Thompson told police a strange story. She said a woman named Florence Fuller had abandoned the child with her. Thompson claimed she was just caring for the child temporarily and didn't know much about where the child had come from or who she really was. The story was vague and suspicious enough that police thought they might have found Mary Agnes. Catherine Moroney was notified immediately. She traveled from Chicago to Rockford, her heart full of hope and fear. Could this really be her daughter? After more than a year, could Mary Agnes have been found? When Catherine arrived at the Rockford police station, she was brought to a room where the little girl waited. Officers watched as Catherine approached the child, studying her carefully. Catherine looked at the girl's face, her hair, her build. She examined the child's teeth, looking for the distinctive features she knew so well. She spent time with the girl, trying to see any sign that this was the baby she'd kissed goodbye on that terrible May afternoon. Finally, Catherine Moroney delivered her verdict. "That is not my baby." The disappointment must have been crushing. For a brief moment, there had been hope. The trip to Rockford, the anticipation, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this could be Mary Agnes. And then the cold reality. This was someone else's child, some other family's missing daughter, but not hers. The identity of the child found with Martha Thompson was never determined. She became another mystery within the larger mystery of missing children in Depression-era America. But for Catherine Moroney, the trip to Rockford was just another reminder that Mary Agnes was still gone, still lost somewhere, with no clues about where to find her. The investigation continued, but more and more, it seemed like Mary Agnes Moroney would never be found. The 1930s dragged on for the Moroney family. Michael continued his work distributing handbills, though the Depression meant even that meager employment was precarious. Catherine raised their growing family, trying to create a normal life for her children, while the ghost of Mary Agnes haunted every moment. They had more children after that third baby born in the summer of 1930. Eventually, they would have 8 children total, but there would always be a hole where Mary Agnes should have been. Every birthday of Mary Agnes's that passed was torture. May 10th became a day of mourning in the Moroney household. The little girl who should have been turning 3, then 4, then 5, was gone. Was she alive? Was she being well cared for? Did she remember her family? Did she cry for her mother? These questions tormented Catherine, particularly on those birthdays. Chicago was changing around them. The Depression deepened, reaching its worst point in 1933 when unemployment in Chicago hit 50%. Half the city was out of work. Crime soared as desperate people did desperate things. The gangster era was in full swing, with Al Capone controlling the largest organized crime operation in the nation. It was against this backdrop of violence, poverty, and chaos that the Moroneys tried to maintain hope that their daughter would somehow be found. The police investigation never officially closed, but it slowed to a crawl. By the mid-1930s, the detectives originally assigned to the case had moved on to other investigations or retired. The file remained open, and tips were still followed up when they came in. But there were fewer and fewer tips. Julia Otis had vanished without a trace, taking Mary Agnes with her. In 1932, something happened that would fundamentally change kidnapping investigations in America: the Lindbergh baby case. On March 1, 1932, 20-month-old Charles Lindbergh Jr., son of the famous aviator Charles Lindbergh, was kidnapped from his family's home in New Jersey. The case became a national sensation. Unlike the Moroneys, the Lindberghs were wealthy and famous, and the kidnapping dominated newspaper headlines for weeks. Tragically, the Lindbergh baby was found dead on May 12, 1932. The murder of this famous child shocked the nation and led to immediate calls for stronger laws against kidnapping. On June 22, 1932, Congress passed the Federal Kidnapping Act, commonly known as the Lindbergh Law. For the first time, kidnapping became a federal crime. The FBI gained jurisdiction to investigate kidnappings that cross state lines. But the new law came too late for Mary Agnes Moroney. Her kidnapping had occurred in May of 1930, more than 2 years before the Lindbergh Law took effect. And because Julia Otis had likely kept Mary Agnes in Illinois rather than taking her to California as claimed, the case remained a matter for Chicago police rather than federal authorities. The FBI had no jurisdiction and no involvement. The Moroneys watched as other families' kidnapping cases received national attention and federal resources, while their own daughter's disappearance remained a local Chicago matter, slowly fading from public consciousness. The injustice of it must have been bitter. Their daughter had been stolen first, before the Lindbergh baby. But because they were poor immigrants rather than wealthy celebrities, Mary Agnes's case received a fraction of the attention and resources. The 1930s became the 1940s. Mary Agnes, if she was still alive, would have been a teenager. Catherine sometimes wondered what she looked like now. Did she resemble her siblings? Was she tall or short? Did she have Catherine's eyes or Michael's smile? The questions were endless and unanswerable. World War II dominated American life from 1941 to 1945. 2 of the Moroney children who came after Mary Agnes were boys, and they served in the military. The family coped with rationing, war news, and the anxiety of having children in danger overseas. But through it all, the question of Mary Agnes never went away. Where was she? Was she alive? Would they ever know? After the war ended, America entered a period of prosperity. The Depression was finally over. Jobs were plentiful. The Moroneys' financial situation improved somewhat. Michael was able to get better work than distributing handbills. The family moved to a better apartment. Life should have been getting better. But Catherine Moroney was deteriorating mentally and emotionally. The loss of Mary Agnes, the guilt she felt about letting the child go with Julia Otis, the years of not knowing it had all taken a severe toll. She fell into deep depression. Some days, she couldn't get out of bed. She would sit for hours, staring at nothing, lost in thoughts of her missing daughter. Michael tried to support her, tried to keep the family together, but he was dealing with his own grief. He'd lost a daughter too. Every time he saw a young woman who was about the age Mary Agnes would be, he wondered, could that be her? Would I recognize my own daughter if I passed her on the street? The Moroney children, who had been born after Mary Agnes disappeared, grew up knowing they had an older sister somewhere. They were told the story of the kidnapping, shown the few photographs the family had of Mary Agnes as a toddler, and taught to hope that someday she might be found. Some of them would spend decades searching for their sister. 1948 marked a significant moment in the case. The Milwaukee Sentinel newspaper published an article titled, "Where Are You, Mary Moroney?" on July 18, 1948. The article recounted the kidnapping, now 18 years in the past, and pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. The article included photographs of Mary Agnes as a toddler and asked readers to imagine what she might look like now at age 20. The article generated some tips, but none led anywhere. It did succeed in keeping the case in public consciousness, reminding Chicagoans that somewhere, a woman in her early 20s might be living under a false identity, might not know she was Mary Agnes Moroney, might not know her family had never stopped looking for her. Then came 1952. And with it, the most elaborate and heartbreaking false identification in the entire Moroney case. It began with Eden Wright, a reporter for the Chicago Daily News. Wright had been following the Moroney case for years and was struck by something he'd noticed. The Moroney siblings, who had been born after Mary Agnes disappeared, all bore striking resemblances to each other. They shared distinctive facial features, particular characteristics that ran in the family. Wright believed these family resemblances might be the key to finding Mary Agnes. Wright contacted the Oakland Tribune newspaper in California. Remember, Julia Otis had claimed she was taking Mary Agnes to California. Wright's theory was that if Mary Agnes had indeed been raised in California, and if she bore the distinctive Moroney family resemblance, someone might recognize her from photographs of her siblings. The Oakland Tribune agreed to help. They published family photographs of the Moroney siblings, along with an article explaining the case and asking readers, "Do you know any 24-year-old women who look like these people?" The article included a description of what Mary Agnes might look like based on her siblings' appearances, and it asked anyone who recognized those features to contact authorities. In San Pablo, California, a small city in the East Bay area near Oakland, a man named Everett McClelland was reading the Oakland Tribune that day. He looked at the photographs of the Moroney siblings. He looked again. Then he went to find his wife. Mary Beck McClelland was 24 years old in 1952. She'd been born, or so she believed, on November 17, 1927. She'd been raised by adoptive parents named Charles and Nora Beck in Martinez, California. She'd married young, at age 15, in 1943, to Everett McClelland, who was an auto mechanic. Mary McClelland knew she was adopted. She'd discovered this fact when she got married at 15. Her adoptive parents had told her then, explaining that they'd taken her in as a baby but weren't her biological parents. Mary had never pursued finding her birth family. She was happy with her adoptive parents and with the life she'd built with Everett. But Everett McClelland looked at those photographs in the Oakland Tribune, and then he looked at his wife, and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Mary looked exactly like the Moroney siblings in the photographs. The resemblance was uncanny. The facial features, the eyes, the shape of the face, it all matched. Everett contacted the authorities immediately. He explained that his wife Mary had been adopted, that her adoption timing roughly matched the Mary Agnes Moroney kidnapping, and most importantly, that she bore an extraordinary resemblance to the Moroney family photographs. The news exploded. Newspapers across the country picked up the story. Missing Moroney girl found in California after 22 years. The Chicago Daily News, which had inadvertently facilitated Mary Agnes's kidnapping by publishing the family's address back in 1930, was particularly aggressive in covering this development. They sent reporters to California and began arranging for scientific testing to determine if Mary Beck McClelland was really Mary Agnes Moroney. What followed was one of the most comprehensive attempts at scientific identification ever conducted in that era. Scientists assembled a battery of tests that they believed would definitively prove whether Mary McClelland was Mary Agnes Moroney. First came blood tests. Dr. Israel Davidson at Mount Sinai Hospital in Chicago conducted over 124 different blood tests on Mary McClelland and various Moroney family members. In 1952, DNA testing didn't exist. The best genetic testing available was blood typing, which looked at various markers in blood that were inherited from parents. The tests couldn't definitively prove someone was related, but they could rule out relationships if the blood types were incompatible. The blood tests came back inconclusive, but promising. Mary McClelland's blood type was compatible with being a child of Michael and Catherine Moroney. The tests couldn't prove she was their daughter, but they didn't rule it out either. Next came anthropological measurements. Scientists measured Mary McClelland's skull, face, and bone structure, comparing these measurements to photographs of Mary Agnes as a toddler and to measurements of the Moroney siblings. The rationale was that certain bone structures and proportions are inherited and remain consistent as a person grows from childhood to adulthood. Again, the results were promising. Mary McClelland's measurements were consistent with what would be expected for Mary Agnes Moroney grown to adulthood. But the most dramatic test came from dentistry. Dr. Bertram S. Krause was a leading dental anthropologist who specialized in identifying people through their teeth. Teeth, like fingerprints, have unique characteristics. The size, shape, and arrangement of teeth are influenced by genetics, and family members often share distinctive dental characteristics. Dr. Krause took dental casts from Mary McClelland. He also took dental casts from all available Moroney family members. Then he conducted a blind test. He mixed Mary McClelland's dental cast with 33 other unmarked dental casts and challenged himself to identify which one belonged to the potential Moroney family member based solely on comparing them to the Moroney family's dental characteristics. Dr. Krause examined all 34 dental casts carefully. He studied the Moroney family casts, identifying the distinctive features that characterized their teeth. Then he examined the unmarked casts one by one, looking for those same features. Finally, he made his selection. He pointed to one cast and declared, "This is the missing Moroney girl." He was right. The cast he'd selected was Mary McClelland's. Dr. Krause issued a formal statement. Based on his dental analysis, Mary Beck McClelland was Mary Agnes Moroney. The precision of his blind test, correctly identifying her cast from among 34 possibilities, seemed to prove beyond doubt that she was the missing Moroney daughter. The Chicago Daily News prepared to publish the most triumphant story in the paper's history. After 22 years, after all the false leads and dashed hopes, Mary Agnes Moroney had been found. Science had proven it. Dr. Krause's dental analysis was considered groundbreaking evidence. Everything seemed to confirm it. The resemblance, the timing of her adoption, the blood tests, the anthropological measurements, and now the dental identification. All that remained was for Catherine Moroney to meet the young woman who might be her daughter. September 4, 1952. Catherine Moroney waited nervously in the office of the Chicago Daily News publisher. She was 40 years old now, worn down by 22 years of grief and not knowing. Michael had wanted to come, but they decided Catherine should meet Mary alone first. This moment was too important, too fragile, to risk overwhelming the young woman with too many emotional Moroneys at once. Catherine's other children waited nearby, hoping that their oldest sister, the one they'd never met but had grown up hearing about, was finally coming home. The newspapers were ready to announce the happy ending to America's longest kidnapping case. Photographers stood ready to capture the reunion. The door opened. Mary Beck McClelland stepped into the room. The two women stood staring at each other. Mary was 24, married. A young woman who'd lived her entire remembered life as Mary Beck, daughter of Charles and Nora Beck, wife of Everett McClelland. Catherine was a 40-year-old woman who'd spent more than 2 decades searching for the 2-year-old daughter stolen from her. They moved toward each other. They embraced tightly. Mary was shorter than Catherine, just 5 feet 2 inches tall, the same height witnesses had described for Julia Otis all those years ago. Catherine held her, felt her, looked at her face from inches away. The resemblance to the Moroney family was undeniable. This young woman could have been a sister to Catherine's other daughters. Catherine whispered, "You look like her. Not you are her. Not you're my daughter. Just you look like her." The photographs were taken. The next day, September 5, 1952, the Chicago Daily News ran its front-page headline, "22-Year Search for Kidnapped Baby Ends." The story proclaimed that Mary Agnes Moroney had been found, that scientific testing had proven her identity, that the Moroney family was finally whole again after more than 2 decades. Mary McClelland was embraced by the entire Moroney family. She met her supposed siblings, her supposed father Michael, her supposed extended family. Everyone commented on how much she looked like a Moroney. The dental evidence seemed irrefutable. The timing of her adoption fit. Everything seemed to match. But Catherine Moroney had doubts. Privately, away from the newspaper reporters and the celebrating family members, Catherine Moroney was troubled. There were problems with identifying Mary McClelland as Mary Agnes Moroney, problems that didn't make it into the triumphant newspaper stories. The most significant issue was a scar. When Mary Agnes Moroney was an infant, she had undergone surgery for a herniated navel. This was a serious medical procedure that would have left a distinctive, permanent scar on her abdomen. It was the kind of scar that would last a lifetime, the kind of identifying mark that couldn't be faked or explained away. Mary McClelland had no such scar. When doctors examined her abdomen, there was no evidence of any surgery in that area. Her navel was perfectly normal, with no scarring. If Mary McClelland was really Mary Agnes Moroney, where was the scar from the hernia surgery? There was also the matter of a birthmark. Mary Agnes Moroney had been born with a strawberry birthmark on her face, the kind of distinctive mark that parents use to identify their children. These birthmarks sometimes fade as children grow, but they usually leave some trace, some slight discoloration or marking. Mary McClelland had no such birthmark. Her face showed no evidence of ever having had one. Then there was the issue of her birth date. Mary McClelland believed she'd been born on November 17, 1927. Mary Agnes Moroney was born on May 10, 1928. That was a difference of nearly 6 months. Could Mary McClelland's birth date be wrong? Could her adoptive parents have lied about when she was born? A doctor named E.W. Merrithew came forward with records. He had delivered Mary Beck, the baby who became Mary McClelland, on November 17, 1927. He had the hospital records to prove it. He'd attended the birth personally. There was no doubt about when Mary McClelland was born, and it was definitely not in May of 1928. If Mary McClelland was born in November of 1927, she couldn't possibly be Mary Agnes Moroney, who wasn't born until 6 months later, in May of 1928. But what about Dr. Krause's dental analysis? How had he correctly identified Mary McClelland's dental cast from among 34 unmarked samples? The answer, though nobody wanted to admit it at the time, was probably coincidence, combined with the fact that the Moroney family's dental characteristics weren't as unique as Dr. Krause had believed. Mary McClelland happened to have teeth that resembled the Moroney family dental patterns, but that resemblance didn't prove biological relationship. The physical resemblance that had started the whole identification, that too was probably coincidence. The Moroney siblings had distinctive features, but they weren't so unique that only a biological Moroney could have them. Mary McClelland looked like she could be a Moroney. But looking similar isn't the same as being related. Years later, Catherine Moroney's grandson, Don Moroney, would reveal what Catherine had privately told family members about Mary McClelland. "She's a great lady. Fantastic person. I wish she was my daughter." But no, Catherine knew. Despite the newspaper headlines, despite the scientific tests, despite wanting so desperately to believe that Mary Agnes had been found, Catherine's maternal instinct told her the truth. This wasn't her daughter. But something remarkable happened despite the failed identification. Mary Beck McClelland and the Moroney family remained close. Even though Catherine didn't believe Mary was really Mary Agnes, even though the evidence increasingly suggested the identification was wrong, Mary McClelland had become part of the family in a different way. Mary McClelland herself wasn't sure what to believe. She'd been raised as Mary Beck. That was her identity. She had loving adoptive parents who'd given her a good life. She'd built her own family with Everett. But now there was this other possibility, this other history. The Moroneys welcomed her so warmly, treated her with such love, that she couldn't help but feel connected to them. She chose to maintain that connection. Throughout the 1950s and beyond, Mary McClelland kept in touch with the Moroney family. She attended family gatherings, she wrote letters, she called on holidays. The Moroneys treated her as one of their own. Even as doubts about the identification grew, the media attention gradually faded. The triumphant headlines of September 1952 gave way to occasional follow-up stories, and then to silence. The question of whether Mary McClelland was really Mary Agnes Moroney remained officially unanswered. The Chicago Police Department never formally declared the identification confirmed or rejected. The case remained open, the mystery unsolved. For Michael and Catherine Moroney, the 1950s brought no resolution, only more heartbreak, hidden behind a veneer of hope. They continued to welcome Mary McClelland into their family while privately knowing she probably wasn't their daughter. What else could they do? After 22 years of searching, this was the closest they'd come to finding Mary Agnes. Even if Mary McClelland wasn't really their daughter, at least she was someone who'd filled a bit of that void. In 1957, Michael J. Moroney died at the age of 58. He'd been born in 1899, survived the Depression, raised 8 children, and spent 27 years searching for the daughter who was stolen from him. According to family accounts, his final words were, "They never found my baby girl." Michael died without knowing what happened to Mary Agnes. He died without knowing if she was alive or dead, happy or suffering, aware of her true identity or completely ignorant of it. He died with that wound still open, that question still unanswered. 27 years of hope, of following leads, of wondering every time he saw a young woman of the right age whether she might be his daughter. 27 years, and no answers. Catherine Moroney outlived her husband by 5 years, dying in 1962 at the age of 49. She was young to die, not even 50 years old, but the Chicago Daily News wrote that the kidnapping of Mary Agnes had eaten into her like a cancer. The guilt Catherine felt over letting Mary Agnes go with Julia Otis had never left her. For 32 years, she'd lived with that decision. 32 years of replaying that moment when Julia Otis asked to take Mary Agnes shopping, 32 years of hearing her daughter's cries in her memory, 32 years of wondering what would have happened if she'd just said no. If she'd insisted on going along, if she'd grabbed Mary Agnes back and slammed the door in Julia Otis's face. Catherine had fallen into deep depression after the kidnapping, and she never truly recovered. Her other children, her husband, her family, none of it could heal the wound of losing Mary Agnes. The 1952 incident with Mary McClelland had briefly given her hope, but the doubts that followed had made things even worse. For a moment, she'd thought Mary Agnes had been found. Then that hope had been slowly crushed as the evidence mounted that Mary McClelland wasn't her daughter after all. Catherine's depression deepened through the late 1950s and into the 1960s. She struggled to function. Some days, she couldn't leave her bed. Her remaining children watched helplessly as their mother slowly deteriorated, consumed by grief and guilt that had been eating at her for more than 3 decades. When Catherine Moroney died in 1962, she died without answers. She'd spent 32 years searching for Mary Agnes. 32 years of hope and heartbreak. 32 years of wondering if her daughter was alive, if she was happy, if she remembered her real family. 32 years of guilt for that one moment when she'd agreed to let a stranger take her 2-year-old daughter. Both Michael and Catherine Moroney died, believing they had failed their daughter. They died believing they would never know what happened to her. They died with the case unsolved, the question unanswered, the wound still bleeding. The Moroney children who survived their parents continued the search. They'd grown up with the ghost of Mary Agnes haunting their family. They'd seen what the kidnapping had done to their mother, watched their father's hopeless searching, experienced the false hope of the Mary McClelland identification. But they didn't give up. Don Moroney, one of Catherine and Michael's sons, became particularly dedicated to finding his sister. He'd never met Mary Agnes. He'd been born after the kidnapping, but he felt connected to her anyway. She was his sister, somewhere out there, and he was determined to find her. Don started researching the case seriously when he was in high school. He collected newspaper clippings, talked to elderly relatives who remembered the kidnapping, tried to track down anyone who might have information. He contacted police periodically, asking if there were any new leads. He searched through records, trying to find some trace of Julia Otis or Mary Agnes. Other Moroney descendants also took up the search. By the 1980s and 1990s, the case was more than 60 years old. Mary Agnes, if she was still alive, would be in her 60s or 70s. Julia Otis, if she was still alive, would be in her 80s or 90s. Most of the people who'd been adults at the time of the kidnapping were dead. Witnesses were gone. Original investigators had long since retired or died. But the Moroneys kept searching. They were aided by a distant relative named Luann DeVries, a genealogist from Zeeland, West Michigan. DeVries had become interested in the case in the 1980s after hearing about it from great-aunts who lived in Chicago. She was distantly related to the Moroneys and felt compelled to help solve the family mystery. DeVries began researching the case using genealogical methods. She traced family trees, looked for adoptions in the right time period, searched through records that might contain clues. It was painstaking work, made more difficult by the fact that adoption records were often sealed and many Depression-era records had been lost or destroyed. In 2008, 78 years after the kidnapping, DNA testing finally provided a definitive answer to one question. Was Mary Beck McClelland really Mary Agnes Moroney? By 2008, DNA testing had become reliable and affordable enough that the Moroney family decided to use it to resolve the question that had lingered since 1952. Mary McClelland had died in 2005 at the age of 77, but her children and grandchildren were alive and willing to provide DNA samples. Samples were collected from Mary McClelland's descendants and from confirmed Moroney family descendants. The samples were sent to a laboratory for analysis. Unlike the primitive blood tests of 1952, modern DNA testing could definitively prove or disprove biological relationships. The results came back conclusive. Mary Beck McClelland was not related to the Moroney family. The identification that had seemed so certain in 1952, that had been proclaimed in newspaper headlines, that had been proven by Dr. Krause's dental analysis, was completely wrong. Mary McClelland had not been Mary Agnes Moroney. The resemblance had been coincidental. The dental match had been coincidental or mistaken. The adoption timing had been coincidental. The Moroney family now knew for certain what Catherine Moroney had suspected all along. The young woman they'd welcomed into their family in 1952, the woman they'd come to love as a friend and honorary family member, was not their missing Mary Agnes. But by then, it didn't really matter to the family's feelings about Mary McClelland. She'd been part of their lives for more than 50 years before her death. She'd been at their weddings and funerals, their holidays and celebrations. She'd been family, even if not by blood. The DNA test didn't change those relationships or those memories. What the DNA test did do was close one door. Mary McClelland wasn't Mary Agnes. That meant Mary Agnes was still out there somewhere, or had been. The search would have to continue. But how could they search for someone who'd been missing for 78 years? Mary Agnes would be 80 years old in 2008. If she was still alive, she'd be an elderly woman. More likely, she'd died years or decades earlier. How could anyone find her now? The answer would come from an unexpected source, a revolution in genealogical research driven by DNA technology and the internet. To understand how the Mary Agnes Moroney case was finally solved in 2023, we need to step back to 2018 and a completely different case. the Golden State Killer. For 40 years, one of California's most prolific serial killers and rapists had evaded capture. The Golden State Killer, also known as the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker, had committed at least 13 murders, 50 rapes, and over 100 burglaries across California from 1974 to 1986. Then he'd simply stopped, vanishing without a trace. Investigators had the killer's DNA. They'd collected it from multiple crime scenes. But when they ran it through CODIS, the combined DNA index system used by law enforcement, they got no matches. The killer had never been arrested for any crime that required DNA submission, so his genetic profile wasn't in the criminal database. For decades, the case remained cold. The killer was probably still alive, but nobody knew who he was or where he was. He'd gotten away with it. Then, in April of 2018, investigators tried something new. Instead of searching criminal DNA databases, they uploaded the killer's genetic profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogy website where people upload their DNA results to find relatives and trace their family trees. GEDmatch worked differently from criminal databases. Instead of looking for exact matches, which would only work if the specific individual was in the database, it looked for partial matches, the kind you'd see between third cousins or fourth cousins. The idea was that even if the killer himself hadn't uploaded his DNA to a genealogy site, maybe some of his relatives had. It worked. The search found multiple distant relatives of the killer. Investigators then used those partial matches to construct a family tree, working backward from the DNA matches to find common ancestors, then forward through the generations to identify all descendants of those common ancestors. They narrowed the suspects by age, sex, and location. Finally, they had a name: Joseph James DeAngelo. On April 24, 2018, police arrested Joseph DeAngelo at his home in Sacramento. He was 72 years old, a former police officer, living a quiet life in a suburb. Nobody suspected him. He'd gotten away with his crimes for 44 years. But genetic genealogy had found him. The arrest of the Golden State Killer was revolutionary. It opened up an entirely new way of solving cold cases. Within months, law enforcement agencies across the country were using genetic genealogy to tackle unsolved murders, rapes, and other crimes from decades past. But to understand how this technology solved the Mary Agnes Moroney case, we need to understand how it works and why it's so powerful. Traditional forensic DNA analysis, the kind used in criminal investigations, looks at about 20 specific locations in a person's genome called STRs, short tandem repeats. These 20 markers are enough to uniquely identify an individual or to confirm parent-child relationships, but they're not detailed enough to identify more distant relatives like cousins. Genetic genealogy DNA testing is completely different. Services like Ancestry.com and 23andMe analyze between 600,000 and 850,000 SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms scattered throughout your genome. These SNPs are the tiny variations in DNA sequence that make each person unique and that get passed down through families in predictable patterns. When you take a genetic genealogy test, your results are compared to everyone else in the database who's also tested. The testing company can identify people who share chunks of DNA with you, indicating common ancestors. The size and number of shared DNA segments tells you approximately how closely related you are. First cousins share about 12.5% of their DNA. Second cousins share about 3.13%. Third cousins share about 0.78%. Even fourth cousins share about 0.2%, not much, but enough to be detectable with these tests. This means that if you upload your DNA results to a genealogy database, the system can identify not just your parents and siblings, but your cousins, second cousins, third cousins, even fourth cousins you've never heard of. And that's what makes genetic genealogy so powerful for identifying unknown people. Let's say you find an unknown body and you want to identify who it is. Traditional DNA analysis is useless unless the person's DNA is already in a criminal database or unless you have a family member to compare it to. But genetic genealogy works differently. You upload the DNA profile to a public database like GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA. You find third cousins, fourth cousins, maybe second cousins. Then you use traditional genealogical research. You build family trees backward from those DNA matches, finding their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, looking for common ancestors. Then you work forward through the generations, identifying all the descendants of those common ancestors. Eventually, you narrow it down to people who match the right age range, sex, location, and other characteristics. The unknown person's identity emerges from the family tree. This process is called investigative genetic genealogy, and it's revolutionized cold case investigations. Since the Golden State Killer arrest in 2018, genetic genealogy has helped solve hundreds of cold cases. Murders from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s have been solved. Unidentified bodies have been given their names back. Families have gotten answers after decades of waiting. But genetic genealogy isn't just useful for criminal cases. It can also solve mysteries, like the Mary Agnes Moroney case, where the question isn't who committed a crime, but what happened to this person. To appreciate how genetic genealogy solved the Moroney case, it helps to understand why older investigation methods had failed so completely. When Mary Agnes was kidnapped in 1930, forensic science was primitive. Fingerprinting existed and was used by police departments, but it required manual comparison of prints, and you needed something to compare them to. If Julia Otis had left fingerprints in the Moroney apartment, which she probably did, those prints were useless unless police could find Julia Otis herself and take her prints to compare. Blood typing existed in 1930, but it was crude. The ABO blood type system had been discovered in 1901, and by 1930 it was being used in criminal investigations. But blood typing could only exclude suspects, not identify them. If blood at a crime scene was type A, that eliminated people with type B, AB, or O blood, but it couldn't tell you which specific type A person it came from. Photography was well established by 1930, and police had photographs of Mary Agnes, but in an era before computerized facial recognition, before the internet, before national databases. How did you use a photograph to find a missing child? You published it in newspapers and hoped someone recognized her. That was it. If Mary Agnes's appearance changed as she grew up, if she was raised in a different city, if Julia Otis never took her out in public, those photographs were nearly useless. Communication technology was limited. Police departments in different cities could communicate by telephone or telegraph, but there was no quick way to share information across the country. The FBI was building its identification division, but it was based on fingerprint cards sent by mail. The idea of a computerized national database was science fiction. Even decades later, when the Mary McClelland identification happened in 1952, the science was still inadequate. The blood tests conducted then were more sophisticated than 1930 tests, but they still couldn't definitively prove identity. The anthropological measurements were educated guesses. The dental analysis, while impressive, was ultimately based on subjective judgment about similarity. The DNA testing that ruled out Mary McClelland in 2008 was much more powerful than anything available in 1952, but it could only answer the question, is this person related to this family? It couldn't answer who is this person, or where is this person. For that, you needed more than just DNA testing. You needed genetic genealogy. By the early 2000s, the investigation of missing persons cases had been revolutionized by technology, but it still faced significant challenges, particularly with very cold cases. The National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, called NamUs, was launched in 2007. For the first time, there was a centralized, searchable database of missing persons cases and unidentified remains from across the country. Law enforcement agencies, medical examiners, and even the public could search the database, potentially making connections that would have been impossible before. DNA databases had become standard in law enforcement. CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, contained millions of DNA profiles from convicted offenders and arrestees. When police found remains or had evidence from a crime, they could quickly compare the DNA to the database and potentially get a match. But these systems had limitations. NamUs only worked if someone entered a missing persons report or an unidentified remains case into the system. CODIS only worked if the person's DNA was in the database, which required previous arrest or conviction for certain crimes. For someone like Mary Agnes Moroney, who'd been kidnapped in 1930 and raised under a different identity, neither system would help. She wasn't in NamUs because nobody had found her remains. She wasn't in CODIS because she'd never been arrested. The revolution came when law enforcement began combining modern DNA analysis with genetic genealogy techniques. Instead of just comparing DNA to criminal databases, investigators could now use public genealogy databases to identify unknown persons through their relatives. This combination of techniques could solve cases that had been unsolvable by any previous method. Several organizations emerged that specialized in this work. Parabon Nanolabs, founded in 2005, became a leader in forensic genetic genealogy. DNA Doe Project, founded in 2017, focused on identifying unknown remains. These organizations combined genetic genealogy expertise with forensic science, offering services to law enforcement agencies trying to solve cold cases. But even with these new tools, solving very old cases remained extremely challenging. The Mary Agnes Moroney case would test the limits of what genetic genealogy could accomplish. In September of 2021, Cook County Sheriff Tom Dart launched an ambitious initiative, the Missing Persons Project. Cook County includes Chicago and much of the surrounding area, and over the decades, thousands of people had gone missing within the sheriff's jurisdiction. Many cases remained unsolved, particularly cases involving women who had vanished years or decades earlier. Sheriff Dart assigned 3 investigators to work full-time on these cold missing persons cases. Their focus was specifically on women who had been missing for more than 3 years and whose cases were listed in the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. The goal was to use modern investigative techniques, including genetic genealogy, to bring closure to families who'd been waiting years or decades for answers. The investigators began working through the cases systematically, starting with the most recent and working backward. They were making progress, solving cases from the 1990s and 2000s, bringing closure to families who'd been waiting 10 or 15 or 20 years for answers. Then, on June 10, 2022, Detective Jose Rodriguez received an unusual assignment. His supervisor handed him a case file from 1930. The case was 92 years old. The victim would be 94 years old if she was still alive, though she was almost certainly long dead. The case was the kidnapping of Mary Agnes Moroney. Detective Rodriguez was surprised. He later said, "I wasn't expecting a 1930 case to pop up." The Missing Persons Project was focused on relatively recent cases, typically from the past few decades. But somehow, the Moroney case had made it onto the list, probably because the family had never given up and had kept the case active in NamUs and other databases. Rodriguez looked at the case file. The original police reports from 1930 were long gone, lost to time and bureaucratic record-keeping changes over 90-plus years. What he had was more recent documentation, files from the 1950s investigation that had wrongly identified Mary McClelland, newspaper articles from various eras, family statements from more recent years, and DNA test results from 2008, proving Mary McClelland wasn't Mary Agnes. A lesser detective might have looked at a 92-year-old case and decided it was unsolvable. Mary Agnes was almost certainly dead. Julia Otis was definitely dead. All the witnesses were dead. The original investigators were dead. The evidence was gone. What could possibly be done after 92 years? But Detective Rodriguez saw something different. He saw a case that could finally be solved using genetic genealogy. The failed 1952 identification meant nothing now. The primitive blood tests and dental analysis from that era had been superseded by modern DNA science. What Rodriguez needed was DNA from confirmed Moroney family members and access to genetic genealogy databases and expertise. Rodriguez later explained his motivation. "This was a mystery that I, personally, just had to figure out how to solve for myself." He began by trying to track down Moroney family descendants who might have DNA samples in genealogy databases or who would be willing to provide samples. Detective Rodriguez's first step was to connect with Moroney family members. Mary Agnes's siblings from the 1930s were all deceased by 2022. Her parents, Michael and Catherine, had died decades earlier in the 1950s and 60s, but Don Moroney was still alive. Don was Mary Agnes's nephew, the son of one of her siblings. He'd been searching for his aunt since he was in high school, despite having never met her. Rodriguez reached out to Don Moroney and explained what he wanted to do. The detective needed DNA samples from confirmed Moroney family descendants to establish what Mary Agnes's genetic profile should look like. Then he could use genetic genealogy techniques to search for relatives and try to trace what had happened to her. Don Moroney was eager to help. He'd been waiting for this kind of breakthrough for decades. He agreed to submit a DNA sample and helped Rodriguez contact other Moroney descendants who might also be willing to test. Rodriguez discovered that some Moroney family members had already taken DNA tests through commercial services like Ancestry.com and 23andMe. These tests had been done for normal genealogical curiosity, not with the specific goal of finding Mary Agnes, but they would prove crucial. With the family's permission, Rodriguez could access these DNA profiles and use them as reference points. Meanwhile, Luann DeVries, The Michigan genealogist who had been researching the Moroney case since the 1980s had also been using DNA in her research. DeVries was a distant relative of the Moroneys, and she'd uploaded her own DNA to various genealogy databases. She'd been building family trees, trying to understand the relationships between various Moroney descendants, hoping that somehow this research might lead to discovering what had happened to Mary Agnes. DeVries had been using a website called DNA Painter, created by genetic genealogist Blaine T. Bettinger. DNA Painter is a tool that helps people visualize their DNA matches and understand how they're related to their various genetic cousins. By mapping out shared DNA segments and comparing them to known relatives, genealogists can identify unknown relatives and figure out how they fit into family trees. As DeVries worked with DNA Painter, analyzing the DNA matches of various Moroney descendants, she noticed something odd. There was a name appearing as a genetic match to Moroney's that didn't fit into the known family tree: Lori Hart. DeVries didn't recognize the name Lori Hart. She couldn't place her in the Moroney family tree. She couldn't figure out how this person was related, but the genetic data said she was definitely a relative, sharing enough DNA with confirmed Moroney descendants to indicate a relatively close relationship. Who was Lori Hart? And how was she related to the Moroney family? DeVries began researching Lori Hart, using the tools of modern genealogy, online databases, public records, family trees posted on genealogy websites. She discovered that Lori Hart's mother was a woman named Terry Arnold, and Terry Arnold's mother was a woman who had died in 2003 named Jeanette Burchard. The timeline was right. If Jeanette Burchard had been born in 1928, she would have been about Mary Agnes's age. If Jeanette Burchard had died in 2003, that would explain why she'd never been found. She'd lived her entire life under a different name, never knowing her true identity. DeVries contacted Detective Rodriguez with this information. They had a lead. The genetic data strongly suggested that Jeanette Burchard had been a Moroney, and the only Moroney who had disappeared was Mary Agnes. But they needed confirmation. They needed someone from Jeanette Burchard's family to take a DNA test and compare it directly to confirmed Moroney descendants. They needed to talk to Terry Arnold. In September of 2022, Detective Jose Rodriguez made a phone call that would change Terry Arnold's life forever. Arnold was living in Florida, going about her normal life, with no idea that a detective in Illinois was about to tell her that her entire family history was a lie. Rodriguez introduced himself and explained that he was investigating a very old missing persons case from Chicago. He told Arnold about Mary Agnes Moroney, kidnapped in 1930 at age 2. Then he told her why he was calling. There was genetic evidence suggesting that Arnold's mother, Jeanette Burchard, might have been Mary Agnes Moroney. Terry Arnold's first reaction was disbelief. "This can't be right," she told the detective. She knew her family history. Her mother had been Jeanette Burchard, raised by a woman named Jeanette Soleric Darris Anderson. Her grandmother had always been loving and kind. "I don't think my grandmother would ever do anything like this," Arnold said. Rodriguez explained the DNA evidence. He explained how genetic genealogy worked, how they'd identified Lori Hart as a genetic match to the Moroney family, how that connection could only be explained if Jeanette Burchard had been a Moroney. He asked Arnold if she would be willing to take a DNA test. Just to be sure, just to check. Arnold agreed, partly to help the detective, but mostly because she was confident the test would prove him wrong. She was certain that her family history was accurate, that her mother had been who she'd always believed her to be. The DNA test would settle this once and for all. Arnold submitted her DNA sample and waited for results. The testing took several weeks. During that time, Arnold thought about what the detective had said. She thought about her mother, about her grandmother, about their family history. Could any of it be true? Could her mother really have been kidnapped as a toddler and raised under a false identity? On October 28, 2022, the DNA results arrived. The DNA test results were unambiguous. Terry Arnold's genetic heritage showed she was primarily Irish, not Polish as she'd expected based on her grandmother's supposed ancestry. More significantly, the test revealed genetic associations with Don Moroney and his cousins, clearly indicating that Arnold was their cousin. The mathematics of genetic inheritance made the relationship clear. Arnold shared too much DNA with the Moroney family for it to be a coincidence or a distant relationship. She was closely related to them. And there was only one explanation that fit. Her mother, Jeanette Burchard, had been Mary Agnes Moroney. Everything Terry Arnold had believed about her family history was wrong. Her mother hadn't been born in April of 1928, as she'd been told. She'd been born in May of 1928 as Mary Agnes Moroney. Her grandmother, Jeanette Burchard Anderson, hadn't adopted or rescued a child. She'd kidnapped one. The woman who'd raised Arnold's mother, the woman Arnold had known and loved as her grandmother, was Julia Otis. Arnold's emotions cycled through shock, anger, disbelief, and eventually acceptance. She was angry at her grandmother for stealing a child, for robbing Mary Agnes of her true identity, for causing 92 years of heartbreak for the Moroney family. But she was also grappling with complex feelings about her own identity and history. Arnold wanted the Moroney family to know something important. She was the world's greatest mom. We adored my mother. The Moroney family can honestly, truly know that she was loved very much. Whatever else had happened, Jeanette Burchard had lived a good life. She'd been loved. She'd raised children who loved her. She'd had a career she enjoyed. She'd been happy. To verify the findings, Detective Rodriguez contacted C.C. Moore, one of the most renowned genetic genealogists in the world. Moore is the chief genetic genealogist for Parabon Nanolabs and had been instrumental in solving numerous cold cases using genetic genealogy techniques. The Chicago Police Department wanted her expert opinion on whether the DNA evidence really proved that Jeanette Burchard was Mary Agnes Moroney. C.C. Moore reviewed all the genetic data, the family trees, the DNA matches, and the relationship calculations. Her conclusion was unambiguous. The genetic evidence was solid. Terry Arnold was a first cousin to Don Moroney and other Moroney descendants. That meant Arnold's mother had been a sibling to Don Moroney's parent. The only Moroney sibling who'd disappeared was Mary Agnes. Therefore, Jeanette Burchard had been Mary Agnes Moroney. After 92 years, the Mary Agnes Moroney case was solved. The woman kidnapped as Mary Agnes Moroney on May 15, 1930, lived her entire life as Jeanette Burchard, dying on October 20, 2003, in Miami, Florida. She was 75 years old, having lived more than 7 decades under a false identity without ever knowing the truth. After Julia Otis kidnapped Mary Agnes, she kept the child in Chicago, raising her as her own daughter just 11 miles from Michael and Catherine Moroney, who were desperately searching for their stolen child. While the Moroneys were publishing pleas in newspapers, checking leads across the country, and hoping for letters or information, Mary Agnes was growing up in the same city, so close yet completely unreachable. The woman who raised Mary Agnes as Jeanette had a complicated history. Jeanette Burchard had been born on August 14, 1909. Her first husband, Gene Damon, died in June of 1928. Her second husband, John Fahey, died in August of 1928, just 2 months after her first husband. The letters Julia Otis had sent to the Moroneys, claiming that Julia Otis had suffered the deaths of her husband and baby the previous year and had suffered a nervous breakdown, aligned with this timeline. In August of 1934, 4 years after kidnapping Mary Agnes, Jeanette Burchard married her third husband, Frank C. Darris. Frank Darris was a police officer with the Berwyn Police Department, a suburb of Chicago. The irony was bitter. Law enforcement in the very city where Mary Agnes's kidnapping remained, an active investigation was living with the kidnapped child, completely unaware of her true identity. The family moved to Virginia around 1934, then to Florida during World War II. Mary Agnes, now known as Jeanette, was told that her birthday was April 14, 1928, close to her actual birthday of May 10, 1928, but different enough to confuse any potential identification. She was told that her biological father had died 2 months after she was born, which may have been a partial truth if Jeanette Burchard was referring to John Fahey's death in August of 1928. Mary Agnes was raised as an only child, despite actually having 7 siblings she never met. She was raised as a devout Catholic. She received a good education. According to her daughter Terry, she was never hungry and never abused at all. The woman who had kidnapped her, for all her faults and crimes, appears to have treated her well and raised her lovingly. Mary Agnes spent over 50 years working as a nurse. She worked for 15 years with Vitas Hospice Care in Miami, helping terminally ill patients and their families. It was noble, compassionate work, and by all accounts, she was excellent at it. The woman who had been stolen from her family grew up to dedicate her life to helping others. She married twice. Her first marriage was to Edward Jennings in the 1940s, when she was still a teenager. That marriage produced 3 children: Terry Arnold, Barbara Joan Jennings, who died in 2006, and Edward Clifton Jennings Jr., who died in 2004. The marriage to Edward ended in divorce in 1961. In 1977, Mary Agnes married Earl Burchard, taking the name Jeanette Burchard that she would carry for the rest of her life. Earl died in 1989, leaving her a widow. Mary Agnes, living as Jeanette Burchard, loved opera, particularly Madame Butterfly, the tragic story of a woman betrayed and separated from her child. She was a passionate fan of the Miami Dolphins football team from the team's founding in 1966. She loved her pets and was especially close to them in her later years. When she died, she was buried with their cremated remains at Our Lady of Mercy Catholic Cemetery in Doral, Miami-Dade County, Florida. She died never knowing her true identity. She died without knowing she had been Mary Agnes Moroney, born to Michael and Catherine Moroney in Chicago, stolen by a woman who pretended to want to help, searched for by a family who never gave up hope. She died without knowing she had siblings, nieces, nephews, cousins, who would have welcomed her with open arms if only they'd known where she was. Frank Darris, the Chicago police officer who'd married the woman who kidnapped Mary Agnes, had once told Jeanette that the woman who raised her was not her natural birth mother. It was a cryptic statement, perhaps reflecting guilt or knowledge about what his wife had done. But when Jeanette asked Chicago relatives about this statement, they claimed to know nothing. Whether they really didn't know or whether they were protecting Jeanette Celerek is unclear. That cryptic statement was the closest Mary Agnes ever came to learning the truth during her lifetime. But she never pursued it further. She accepted the vague explanation and continued her life as Jeanette Burchard, never discovering that her true name was Mary Agnes Moroney and that she had a family who'd been searching for her for 73 years. Though the identity of Mary Agnes Moroney had finally been solved, the identity of the woman who called herself Julia Otis was never officially confirmed. The Chicago Police Department never filed charges, never issued an arrest warrant with a real name, never formally accused anyone of the kidnapping. But the evidence, circumstantial as it is, points strongly to one person, Jeanette Celerek Darris Anderson. Let's examine what we know about the woman who raised Mary Agnes. Jeanette Celerek was born on August 14, 1909, making her 20 years old at the time of the kidnapping in May of 1930. Witnesses describe Julia Otis as appearing to be around 22 or 23 years old, though she could have been younger. The age fits. Julia Otis was described as 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing approximately 125 pounds. These physical characteristics match the general build of Jeanette Celerek based on later photographs, though precise measurements from the 1930s are not available for comparison. More tellingly, look at the timeline of Jeanette Celerek's marriages and losses. Her first husband, Gene Damon, died in June of 1928. Her second husband, John Fahey, died just 2 months later, in August of 1928. The letters sent by Julia Otis and Alice Henderson claimed that Julia Otis had suffered the deaths of her husband and baby the previous year, 1929, and had suffered a nervous breakdown as a result. The timing doesn't match exactly, but it's close enough to be significant. Jeanette Celerek had lost 2 husbands within 2 months in 1928, not 1929. The letter's claim about losing a baby is harder to verify. There are no official records of Jeanette Celerek having children before the kidnapping, but miscarriages or infant deaths weren't always well documented in that era, especially for working-class families. It's entirely possible she'd been pregnant during one or both of her brief marriages and had lost the baby. What we know for certain is that Jeanette Celerek never had biological children. She only raised Mary Agnes, whom she kidnapped. A woman who desperately wanted children, who had perhaps suffered miscarriages or infant loss, who had lost 2 husbands in rapid succession. Such a woman might indeed become love-hungry enough to steal someone else's child. The 1930 census provides important clues about Jeanette Celerek's location at the time of the kidnapping. The census shows Jeanette Celerek living with John Fahey and her mother in Chicago around the time of the kidnapping. City directories and census records place her various addresses approximately 11 miles from the Moroney's apartment at 5200 South Wentworth Avenue. 11 miles. That's how close Mary Agnes was being raised to her biological parents. 11 miles separating Michael and Catherine Moroney from their stolen daughter. 11 miles that might as well have been 11,000 miles, because without any way to identify Julia Otis or track down Mary Agnes, the distance was insurmountable. Think about what that means. While Michael Moroney walked the streets of Chicago distributing handbills, earning his $15 a week, his daughter might have passed him on the street. While Catherine Moroney shopped for groceries or took her other children to the park, Mary Agnes might have been in the same store, the same park, just a few feet away. Neither would have recognized the other. Mary Agnes had been only 2 years old when she was taken. By the time she was 5, 7, 10 years old, she would have looked nothing like the toddler Catherine remembered. Jeanette Burchard could have taken Mary Agnes anywhere in Chicago without fear of recognition. The city was huge, with over 3 million people by the 1930 census. The chance of randomly encountering the Moroneys was infinitesimally small. And even if they had somehow crossed paths, even if Catherine Moroney had seen Mary Agnes on the street, she wouldn't have recognized her own daughter after a few years had passed. The letters Julia Otis sent to the Moroneys reveal a complex psychology. This wasn't a simple stranger abduction where a criminal snatches a child off the street for ransom or other criminal purposes. Julia Otis was calculated and manipulative. She researched her victim family through the newspaper column that had published their address. She visited twice, building trust before taking the child. She sent letters afterward, maintaining some kind of psychological connection to the family she'd devastated. The first visit, on May 14th, was reconnaissance. Julia Otis came to assess the situation, to see if the Moroneys were as vulnerable and desperate as the newspaper column suggested, to determine if they might be manipulated. She made her offer to take Mary Agnes to California temporarily, knowing Catherine would likely refuse. But the refusal didn't matter. What mattered was planting the seed of the idea, making herself seem generous and helpful, establishing herself as someone who cared about the family's welfare. The $2 she left was brilliant psychological manipulation. $2 was a significant amount to a family earning $15 a week. It created a sense of obligation, made Julia Otis seem genuinely generous, and ensured that Catherine would remember her positively and might be more receptive when she returned. The second visit, just 24 hours later, built on that foundation. Julia Otis brought baby clothes, a practical gift that demonstrated continued generosity. She claimed to have arranged a better job for Michael, making herself seem even more helpful and connected. Then, she made her move. Not asking to take Mary Agnes away for weeks or months, but just for a quick shopping trip to buy clothes. It was a much smaller request, much easier for Catherine to agree to, and it got Julia Otis what she wanted: Mary Agnes out of the apartment and away from her mother. The fact that Mary Agnes cried and resisted is heartbreaking but also revealing. Children often sense danger that adults miss. Mary Agnes's instincts were screaming at her not to go with this stranger. But at 2 years old, she had no power to resist an adult who was determined to take her. The letters Julia Otis sent afterward are perhaps the most psychologically complex part of the case. Why send letters at all? Many kidnappers would simply disappear and never contact the victim's family again. But Julia Otis wrote twice, including money, maintaining this strange connection to the Moroneys. The first letter tried to reassure the family that Mary Agnes was safe and would be returned. It claimed Mary Agnes was being cared for by a nurse, dressed like a princess, and would be back in 2 months. The lie about Mary Agnes not crying at all reveals either that Julia Otis was trying to convince herself that the kidnapping was acceptable, or that she was deliberately trying to ease the Moroneys' fears that their daughter had been traumatized. The second letter, written under the fictional name Alice Henderson, was even more manipulative. By inventing a cousin to explain Julia Otis's actions, the kidnapper was trying to generate sympathy and understanding. She wanted the Moroneys to see Julia Otis as a mentally ill, grieving woman who'd acted impulsively out of emotional desperation, not as a calculated criminal who'd stalked them through a newspaper column and deliberately stolen their child. Both narratives, the desperate, mentally ill woman and the generous benefactor who would return Mary Agnes, were false. Julia Otis kept Mary Agnes permanently, raising her as her own daughter under a different name. She never intended to return the child. The promise to return her in 2 months was a lie to buy time, to keep the Moroneys from panicking in those first crucial weeks when immediate, aggressive police action might have recovered Mary Agnes. By the time 2 months had passed and the Moroneys realized Mary Agnes wasn't coming back, the trail was cold. Julia Otis had successfully disappeared with her stolen child. Julia Otis's success in evading capture and keeping Mary Agnes hidden for 93 years wasn't just luck. It was a combination of careful planning, favorable circumstances, and the limitations of 1930-era law enforcement. First, consider the planning. Julia Otis didn't randomly snatch a child off the street. She read newspaper columns, looking for vulnerable families. When the Moroneys' address was published, she had a target. She visited twice before taking Mary Agnes, establishing herself as a trustworthy helper. She timed her kidnapping carefully. A Thursday afternoon when Michael was at work and Catherine was home alone with the children. She took Mary Agnes under the pretense of a short shopping trip, not a permanent removal, which made Catherine less likely to immediately call police. Julia Otis kept Mary Agnes in Chicago, despite claiming she was taking the child to California. This was crucial to avoiding detection. Police immediately checked trains and buses heading west, contacted authorities in California, and watched for a woman traveling with a small child. But Mary Agnes wasn't on any of those trains or buses. She was still in Chicago, just 11 miles from her old home, hidden in plain sight. Jeanette Burchard likely told neighbors and family that she'd adopted a child, or that she was caring for a relative's child, or some other cover story that explained Mary Agnes's sudden appearance. In 1930, especially in working-class neighborhoods, people didn't ask too many questions about such things. Informal adoptions and relatives taking in children were common, especially during the Depression when many families were breaking apart under economic pressure. Mary Agnes was young enough, just 2 years old, that she would quickly adapt to her new identity. Within months, she would have forgotten her life as Mary Agnes Moroney, forgotten her mother Catherine, forgotten her baby sister Anastasia. Young children's memories are malleable, and a determined caretaker can easily reshape a 2-year-old's understanding of their own history. Jeanette Burchard told Mary Agnes a false birthday, April 14th, instead of May 10th, close enough to the truth that Mary Agnes wouldn't question it, but different enough to confuse any potential identification. She told Mary Agnes that her father had died when she was 2 months old, a story that made Mary Agnes an orphan in her own mind, and explained why she had no father figure until Jeanette married Frank Darris in 1934. The move to Virginia, in 1934, 4 years after the kidnapping, put even more distance between Mary Agnes and her past. By the time the family moved to Florida during World War II, Mary Agnes was a teenager who had no memory of Chicago, no memory of being anyone other than Jeanette, daughter of Jeanette Burchard Darris. But perhaps the most important factor in Julia Otis never being caught was the limitation of law enforcement in the 1930s. Remember, kidnapping wasn't a federal crime until June of 1932, more than 2 years after Mary Agnes was taken. The case remained a Chicago matter, with no FBI involvement. Without federal jurisdiction, there was no coordination between law enforcement agencies in different states, no centralized investigation, no pooling of resources. Even within Chicago, police resources were stretched thin. The Depression had devastated the city's budget. The police force was understaffed and overwhelmed with rising crime rates. Gangsters like Al Capone controlled much of the city. Prohibition enforcement consumed enormous resources. A missing child from a poor immigrant family, while certainly investigated, couldn't command the kind of sustained attention that a wealthy family's kidnapping would receive. There were no computerized databases, no fingerprint matching systems beyond manual comparison, no surveillance cameras, no credit card records, no cell phone tracking, no internet searches. Julia Otis could simply disappear, change her daily routines, move to a different neighborhood, and effectively vanish. Without extraordinary luck or a witness who recognized her, police had no way to track her down. The photograph of Mary Agnes, published in newspapers, was of a 2-year-old. Even by age 4 or 5, Mary Agnes's appearance would have changed enough that most people wouldn't recognize her from that photograph. By age 10, she would look completely different. The photograph was useless for identifying her. Catherine and Michael Moroney's poverty also worked against them. They had no money to hire private investigators, no influence to pressure police for more resources, no wealthy friends or family who could offer rewards large enough to motivate extensive public searching. They could only wait, hope, and pray that someone would find Mary Agnes. Julia Otis had every advantage. She had successfully stolen a child from a vulnerable family, and 1930 America's law enforcement and social infrastructure was simply not equipped to find that child once she'd been taken. When Terry Arnold learned in October of 2022 that her mother had been kidnapped as a toddler, that her grandmother was the kidnapper, and that her entire family history was built on a crime, she had to process an almost unimaginable revelation. Think about what this meant for Arnold. Everything she'd believed about her family's origin story was false. Her mother wasn't who she thought she was. Her grandmother, a woman Arnold had known and loved, was a criminal who had destroyed another family to build her own. The names, the dates, the family stories, all of it was constructed on lies. Arnold told reporters that she had felt anger toward her grandmother upon learning the truth. That anger is understandable. Jeanette Burchard Darris Anderson had stolen a child, had caused 93 years of suffering for the Moroney family, had robbed Mary Agnes of her true identity and her biological family. She'd lived her entire life without facing consequences for that crime, dying peacefully in 2007 at the age of 97 or 98. But Arnold's feelings were necessarily complicated. Yes, her grandmother had committed a terrible crime, But she'd also raised Arnold's mother lovingly, had given her a good life, had been a grandmother to Arnold herself. How do you reconcile those two truths? How do you hate someone for a crime while also loving them for the family they created? Arnold wanted the Moroney family to know that her mother, Mary Agnes, had lived a good life. She was the world's greatest mom, Arnold emphasized. We adored my mother. The Moroney family can honestly, truly know that she was loved very much. In Arnold's mind, this was important. The Moroneys had spent 93 years wondering what happened to Mary Agnes, whether she'd suffered, whether she'd been abused or neglected, whether she'd died young or lived a full life. Arnold wanted them to know, Mary Agnes had been happy. She'd been loved. She'd raised children who adored her. She'd had a meaningful career helping others. She'd lived until age 75, a reasonably long life. But Arnold drew a firm line when authorities asked her to consider exhuming her mother's body for definitive DNA confirmation. The genetic genealogy evidence was already conclusive. There was virtually no doubt that Jeanette Burchard had been Mary Agnes Moroney. But for the case to be formally closed under NAMA's criteria, direct DNA comparison would be needed. That would require exhuming Jeanette Burchard's body from her grave at Our Lady of Mercy Catholic Cemetery in Doral, Florida. Arnold refused. I already told them, in the beginning, no. Her mother had been dead since 2003. She'd been buried with dignity, with her beloved pet's cremated remains, in a peaceful cemetery. Arnold was not going to allow her mother's body to be dug up and disturbed. The genetic evidence was strong enough. Her mother had lived her whole life, not knowing she was Mary Agnes Moroney. Let her rest in peace under the name she'd known. This decision meant the case couldn't be completely closed under official criteria. There would always be that tiny asterisk, that technical notation that direct DNA confirmation hadn't been obtained. But for practical purposes, everyone involved, the Chicago Police Department, the Cook County Sheriff's Office, the Moroney family, and C.C. Moore agreed that the evidence was sufficient. Jeanette Burchard had been Mary Agnes Moroney. The mystery was solved. To fully understand the Mary Agnes Moroney case, we must understand the world that produced it. The Great Depression created conditions where children became vulnerable in ways that are hard to imagine today. The stock market crash of October 1929 is often marked as the beginning of the Depression, but the economic devastation took time to fully develop. By 1930, when Mary Agnes was kidnapped, the Depression was just beginning to show its true horror. Banks were failing. Businesses were closing. Unemployment was rising rapidly. In Chicago, unemployment would eventually reach 50% by 1933. Half the city without work, half the city desperate. The Moroney family was already struggling before the Depression began. Michael's job distributing handbills paid only $15 per week, barely enough to support a family even in good times. When Mary Agnes was kidnapped in May of 1930, the family was living hand to mouth, depending on the kindness of social services and whatever help they could get. That desperation made them targets. Julia Otis specifically sought out desperate families by reading social services columns in newspapers. She knew that desperate people would be easier to manipulate, more likely to accept help from strangers, less likely to ask questions. She knew that a family earning $15 a week, with a pregnant mother scrubbing floors and 2 babies to care for, would jump at any offer of assistance. The Depression created millions of families like the Moroneys. Economic catastrophe tore families apart. Children were sent to live with relatives who could better afford to feed them. Orphanages overflowed with children whose parents could no longer care for them. Some parents, in desperation, gave children to strangers who promised to provide better lives. The social fabric was shredding under economic pressure. Against this backdrop, a missing child from a poor family didn't generate the kind of attention it might have received in better times. Police were overwhelmed with crime driven by desperation, robberies, burglaries, violence. Chicago was in the grip of the gangster era, with Al Capone's organization controlling much of the city through violence and corruption. The kidnapping of a 2-year-old from a poor immigrant family, while certainly investigated, couldn't command sustained resources when the entire city seemed to be falling apart. The Depression also facilitated Julia Otis's crime in another way. It normalized the movement of children. With so many families in crisis, it wasn't unusual for a woman to suddenly appear with a young child, claiming to have adopted her or to be caring for a relative's child. Neighbors wouldn't ask too many questions. Everyone knew that families were breaking apart, that children were being shifted around as parents desperately tried to keep them fed. Julia Otis's sudden appearance with Mary Agnes wouldn't have seemed particularly suspicious in that context. The Chicago that Mary Agnes Moroney was kidnapped from was one of the most violent cities in America. To understand how Julia Otis got away with her crime, we need to understand the law enforcement environment of 1930 Chicago. By the mid-1920s, an estimated 1,300 gangs operated in Chicago. These weren't small street gangs. Many were well-organized criminal enterprises involved in bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and violence. Prohibition, which had begun in 1920 and would last until 1933, had created a massive illegal alcohol industry worth billions in today's dollars. Gangsters fought brutal wars for control of this lucrative trade. Al Capone, by 1930, controlled the largest organized crime operation in the nation. His organization had an estimated income of $60 million per year, over $1 billion in today's money. Capone had successfully corrupted large portions of Chicago's police force and political establishment. Some officers were on his payroll, others were intimidated into inaction by threats of violence. The Chicago Police Department was simultaneously corrupt and overwhelmed. Honest officers trying to do their jobs faced violence from gangsters and obstruction from corrupt colleagues. Resources were stretched impossibly thin. The department's focus was necessarily on the most visible, most violent crimes: murders, shootings, bombings. The kidnapping of a child from a poor family, while certainly a serious crime, competed for attention with multiple murders every week and a level of organized violence unprecedented in American history. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre had occurred just 15 months before Mary Agnes's kidnapping. On February 14, 1929, 7 men associated with the Bugs Moran gang were lined up against a wall and machine-gunned to death by Al Capone's men. The brutality shocked the nation and demonstrated the level of violence Chicago had descended into. In this environment, Julia Otis's kidnapping of Mary Agnes was, in some ways, a relatively minor crime from law enforcement's perspective. No one had been killed, no ransom had been demanded, no violence had occurred. A woman had taken a child, sent letters claiming the child would be returned, and then simply disappeared. It was a terrible crime that devastated a family, but compared to the daily violence and murder occurring in Chicago, it didn't rise to the level of urgent priority. This isn't to excuse the police department's failure to find Mary Agnes. It's simply to explain the context. In a city with less crime, with more resources, with less corruption, the investigation might have been more successful. But in 1930 Chicago, Julia Otis chose the perfect time and place to commit her crime and disappear. The Mary Agnes Moroney kidnapping occurred at a crucial moment in American legal history, just before kidnapping became a federal crime. Understanding what changed after the Lindbergh baby case helps explain why Mary Agnes was never found. When Mary Agnes was kidnapped in May of 1930, kidnapping was purely a local crime. If someone kidnapped a child in Chicago, it was Chicago Police Department's problem. If the kidnapper crossed state lines into Indiana or Wisconsin, Chicago police had no jurisdiction. They could ask police in other jurisdictions for help, but there was no requirement for cooperation. No federal agency coordinating multi-state investigations. No centralized resources. This meant that a kidnapper who was smart enough to cross state lines could effectively escape. The kidnapper would be wanted in one state, but unless they were caught and identified in another state, there was no way to connect them to the crime. Police departments in different states didn't routinely share information. There was no national database of wanted criminals that could be quickly searched. Then came the Lindbergh baby case. Charles Lindbergh was one of the most famous people in America. A hero aviator who'd made the first solo transatlantic flight in 1927. He'd married Anne Morrow, daughter of the U.S. ambassador to Mexico. They were American royalty, celebrities followed by millions. On March 1, 1932, their 20-month-old son, Charles Lindbergh Jr., was kidnapped from the family's home in Hopewell, New Jersey. A ransom note demanding $50,000 was left in the nursery. The kidnapping became a national sensation, dominating newspaper headlines for weeks. The Lindberghs paid the ransom. On May 12, 1932, the baby's body was found in the woods, less than 5 miles from the Lindbergh home. The child had been killed, likely on the night of the kidnapping. The nation was horrified and outraged. Public pressure for stronger kidnapping laws was immediate and overwhelming. Congress moved quickly. On June 22, 1932, just over a month after the Lindbergh baby's body was found, Congress passed the Federal Kidnapping Act, commonly called the Lindbergh Law. The new law made it a federal crime to transport a kidnapping victim across state lines. This gave the FBI jurisdiction over interstate kidnapping cases and provided federal resources for investigations. It meant that kidnapping was no longer just a local crime that could be easily escaped by crossing state lines. Now, federal agents could pursue kidnappers anywhere in the country. The Lindbergh Law was revolutionary for law enforcement. It gave investigators tools and resources they'd never had before, but it came too late for Mary Agnes Moroney. Her kidnapping had occurred in May of 1930, more than 2 years before the Lindbergh Law took effect. And because Julia Otis had kept Mary Agnes in Illinois rather than crossing state lines, the FBI would have had no jurisdiction even after the law passed. The contrast between the Lindbergh case and the Moroney case is stark and painful. The Lindberghs were wealthy and famous. Their son's kidnapping generated massive national attention, federal legislative action, and unprecedented investigative resources. The Moroneys were poor immigrants. Their daughter's kidnapping was barely known outside Chicago, generated no federal response, and was investigated with limited local resources. Mary Agnes Moroney was kidnapped before the Lindbergh baby, but her case received a fraction of the attention and resources. If the order had been reversed, if the Lindbergh Law had existed in May of 1930, would Mary Agnes have been found? We'll never know. But the timing of her kidnapping meant she fell into a gap in American law enforcement, a gap that the Lindbergh case would close, but too late to help her. Julia Otis's ability to hide Mary Agnes in plain sight was facilitated by a shadowy infrastructure that most Americans knew nothing about: illegal adoption networks that trafficked in stolen and coerced children throughout the early 20th century. The most infamous of these networks was run by Georgia Tann, who operated the Tennessee Children's Home Society from 1924 to 1950. Tann's operation was a criminal enterprise that destroyed thousands of families, but it operated under the cover of legitimate adoption services. Tann's methods were similar to Julia Otis's in some ways. She targeted poor families, often telling mothers that their children would be better off with wealthier adoptive parents. She falsified records, created fake birth certificates, and facilitated illegal adoptions to wealthy families across the country. Many of her adoptive parents were celebrities, including Joan Crawford and June Allison, who had no idea the children they'd adopted had been stolen or coerced from their biological parents. Approximately 5,000 children passed through Tann's organization. Some 500 children died in her care due to neglect and abuse. The survivors were scattered across the country, many never learning their true identities. The operation wasn't shut down until 1950, after 26 years of operation. Tann's network demonstrated how easy it was to make children disappear into new identities in the early to mid-20th century. Birth certificates could be falsified. Adoption records could be sealed. Children too young to remember their origins could be told any story about their past, and they would accept it as truth. Julia Otis didn't need to be part of an organized network like Tann's. She only needed to kidnap one child, not 5,000. But Tann's success at hiding thousands of children for decades demonstrates that the infrastructure existed to support such crimes. Records were poorly maintained. Verification systems were inadequate. Cross-jurisdictional coordination was minimal. A determined criminal with basic knowledge of the system could easily create a false identity for a child. Mary Agnes's false birth date, April 14th, instead of May 10th, and false backstory, father died 2 months after she was born, were probably supported by fake or altered documents. Julia Otis, or later Jeanette Burchard, could have easily obtained a birth certificate that showed Jeanette being born in April of 1928 to parents who didn't exist. Such documents were routinely falsified in that era, and there was no centralized system to catch discrepancies. When the family moved to Virginia in 1934 and then to Florida during World War II, Mary Agnes's false identity moved with her. School enrollment, medical records, and other documents all reinforced her identity as Jeanette, not Mary Agnes. With each passing year, with each new document created under the false name, the true identity became more buried. By the time Mary Agnes was an adult, her identity as Jeanette was thoroughly established in official records. She had a social security number under that name. She had school transcripts, marriage licenses, employment records. The paperwork of her entire adult life confirmed she was Jeanette Burchard, not Mary Agnes Moroney. Without DNA testing, which wouldn't be invented for another 50 years, there was no way to prove otherwise. On February 3, 2023, 92 years, 8 months, and 19 days after Mary Agnes Moroney was kidnapped, the Chicago Police Department Cold Case Unit officially closed the investigation. It was one of the oldest missing persons cases ever solved in American history, and certainly the oldest solved kidnapping in Chicago Missing Persons Bureau history. The closure came after Detective Jose Rodriguez and his team had spent months working with genetic genealogists, the Moroney family, and Terry Arnold to confirm what the DNA evidence had revealed. C.C. Moore's validation of the genetic genealogy findings provided the scientific certainty needed. The Chicago Police Department was satisfied that Jeanette Burchard had been Mary Agnes Moroney. But the official closure came with limitations. Because Terry Arnold had refused to allow exhumation of her mother's body for direct DNA comparison, the case couldn't be completely closed under NamUs criteria. Technically, the case remained in a kind of limbo, solved for all practical purposes, but without the final piece of physical evidence that would allow it to be removed from the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System database. The Chicago Police Department decided to move forward with closure anyway. The circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. The genetic genealogy evidence was as close to certain as science could provide without direct testing. Multiple experts, including one of the world's leading genetic genealogists, had validated the findings. Continuing to keep the case open would serve no purpose except to satisfy a technical requirement. On February 17, 2023, 2 weeks after the official closure, the Chicago Sun-Times broke the story to the public. Reporter John Seidel wrote the article that finally told the world what had happened to Mary Agnes Moroney. The headline captured the extraordinary nature of the case. After 93 years, Mary Agnes had been found. The story spread quickly through media outlets. National news organizations picked it up. True crime podcasts discussed it. Genetic genealogy communities celebrated it as one of their field's most remarkable successes. The case became a symbol of what modern DNA technology could accomplish, solving mysteries that had seemed permanently unsolvable. For the Chicago Police Department, the closure represented vindication of Sheriff Tom Dart's decision to launch the Missing Persons Project in September of 2021. The project had been designed to bring closure to families of missing women, using modern techniques to solve old cases. The Moroney case demonstrated that even cases from the distant past, cases that seemed impossibly old and cold, could be solved with dedication, expertise, and the revolutionary tools of genetic genealogy. Detective Jose Rodriguez reflected on the case with satisfaction. "This was a mystery that I, personally, just had to figure out how to solve for myself," he'd said when he first received the assignment. 9 months later, he'd done exactly that. He'd taken a 92-year-old case, with no living witnesses, no physical evidence, no original police reports, and solved it using DNA and genealogical research. It was the kind of investigative work that becomes legend within law enforcement circles. Commander Jason Morin of the Cook County Sheriff's Office praised the work, noting that the case demonstrated the power of persistence and modern technology working together. The investigation had required cooperation between law enforcement, professional genetic genealogists, amateur genealogists like Luann DeVries, and family members willing to provide DNA and information. It was a model for how very cold cases could be approached in the DNA era. Don Moroney was 55 years old when he learned what had happened to his Aunt Mary Agnes. He'd been born long after the kidnapping, had never met the aunt who disappeared before his father was even born, but he'd been searching for her since high school. Now, finally, he had answers. Don had grown up hearing stories about Mary Agnes from his grandmother Catherine and his grandfather Michael before they died. He'd heard about the well-dressed woman who called herself Julia Otis, about the letters that promised Mary Agnes would be returned, about the false hope of the Mary McClelland identification in 1952. He'd watched his grandmother's depression, seen how the loss of Mary Agnes had eaten away at her for decades. As a teenager, Don had started collecting newspaper clippings about the case. He'd talked to elderly relatives who remembered the kidnapping. He'd contacted police periodically, asking if there were any new leads. When DNA testing became available, he'd submitted his own DNA to multiple databases, hoping that somehow, someday, it might lead to finding Mary Agnes. Living in Flanagan, Illinois, a small town about 90 miles southwest of Chicago, Don had never stopped thinking about his missing aunt. The case had become a defining part of the Moroney family identity. Every family gathering included discussions about Mary Agnes. Every new advance in missing persons investigation technology prompted Don to wonder if maybe this would be the breakthrough that found her. When Detective Rodriguez contacted Don in 2022 and asked for DNA samples and family information, Don had been hopeful but cautious. There had been false leads before. The Mary McClellan case had taught the family not to get their hopes up too quickly, but as the investigation progressed, as the genetic evidence mounted, Dawn began to believe this might finally be real. When the confirmation came in October of 2022 that Jeanette Burchard had been Mary Agnes, Dawn's emotions were complex. Relief that the mystery was finally solved. Sadness that Mary Agnes had died in 2003 without ever knowing her true identity. Grief that his grandparents had died without answers, that they'd spent their final years still searching, still hoping. Anger at Julia Otis for stealing Mary Agnes and causing so much pain, but also gratitude that Mary Agnes had lived a good life, had been loved, had died peacefully, at 75, without the trauma of learning she'd been kidnapped. Dawn spoke to reporters about the family's reaction. One of our hopes was that, when Mary was taken, that she led a good life and she was taken care of. And she was. It was the best possible outcome given the circumstances. Mary Agnes couldn't be returned to her family, she died nearly 20 years earlier, but at least the Moroneys now knew she'd been happy. Dawn shared details about Mary Agnes's life with other Moroney descendants. They learned that their long-lost relative had been a nurse for over 50 years, that she'd loved opera and the Miami Dolphins, that she'd been devoted to her children and pets. They looked at photographs of Jeanette Burchard and saw the Moroney family resemblance. She'd looked like them. She would have fit right in at family gatherings if only she'd known who she was. The Moroney family contacted Terry Arnold, establishing a relationship with their newly discovered cousins. Arnold shared memories of her mother, told stories about Jeanette Burchard's life, and helped the Moroneys understand who Mary Agnes had become. Despite the tragic circumstances of how Mary Agnes ended up with the Burchard family, both sides were grateful to have found each other. Don Moroney also expressed appreciation for everyone who'd worked to solve the case. He thanked Detective Rodriguez and the Cook County Sheriff's Office. He thanked Luann DeVries for her decades of genealogical research. He thanked C.C. Moore for validating the genetic evidence. He thanked Terry Arnold for providing DNA and information, despite the pain of learning her grandmother was a kidnapper. Most of all, Don wished his grandparents could have known. Catherine and Michael Moroney had died in 1962 and 1957, respectively, having spent the last decades of their lives wondering what had happened to their daughter. They died with that wound still open, that question unanswered. Don deeply regretted that they'd never had closure, never learned that Mary Agnes had lived a good life just miles away from them. For Terry Arnold, learning that her mother had been kidnapped as a toddler and that her grandmother was the kidnapper required a profound psychological adjustment. Everything she'd believed about her family history was false. Her entire understanding of her origins had to be rebuilt from scratch. Arnold had grown up knowing her mother as Jeanette Burchard, a loving, devoted nurse who'd raised her children with care and attention. Arnold's memories of her mother were entirely positive. Jeanette had been the world's greatest mom. As Arnold repeatedly told reporters, she'd been present, affectionate, supportive. She'd worked hard to provide for her children. She'd instilled good values in them. Arnold had no complaints about her upbringing. Arnold had also known her grandmother, Jeanette Celerek Darris Anderson, as a seemingly normal woman. Whatever crimes her grandmother had committed in 1930, whatever lies she'd told, whatever trauma she'd caused the Moroney family, Arnold had never seen that side of her. To Arnold, her grandmother had been family, a woman who'd raised Arnold's mother and been part of Arnold's own childhood. Learning the truth forced Arnold to completely reconsider her grandmother. This woman, who Arnold had known as family, was actually a kidnapper who'd stalked the Moroney family through newspaper articles, manipulated a desperate teenage mother, stolen a 2-year-old child, and caused 93 years of suffering. Her grandmother had lived her entire life without facing consequences, dying peacefully in 2007 at 97 or 98 years old. Arnold told reporters she felt anger toward her grandmother after learning the truth. That anger was natural and justified. Her grandmother had committed a terrible crime. She'd destroyed the Moroney family's happiness. She'd robbed Mary Agnes of her true identity and her biological family. She'd built her entire family on a foundation of lies and stolen identity. But Arnold also had to grapple with the complexity of her feelings. Yes, her grandmother was a criminal, but she'd also raised Arnold's mother well. She'd given Mary Agnes a good life, even if it was under a false identity. She'd been loving and caring, at least according to everything Arnold knew. How do you reconcile those contradictions? How do you hate someone for their crimes while acknowledging that they also did something good by raising your mother well? Arnold made a deliberate choice to focus on the positive outcome for her mother. She emphasized to reporters and to the Moroney family that Mary Agnes had been loved, had been happy, had never suffered abuse or neglect. She wanted the Moroneys to know that their sister and aunt had lived a good life, even if she'd lived it under the wrong name and the wrong family. But Arnold also drew clear boundaries about how far she was willing to go in helping resolve the case. When authorities asked her to consider exhuming her mother's body for direct DNA testing, Arnold refused. Her mother had been dead since 2003. She'd been buried with dignity at Our Lady of Mercy Catholic Cemetery. Arnold was not going to disturb her mother's remains just to satisfy a technical requirement for case closure. "I already told them. In the beginning?" "No," Arnold said firmly. The genetic genealogy evidence was sufficient. C.C. Moore had validated it. Everyone involved agreed that Jeanette Burchard had been Mary Agnes Moroney. There was no need to dig up her mother's body to prove what was already proven. This decision meant the case couldn't be completely closed under NamUs technical criteria. But Arnold didn't care about bureaucratic requirements. She cared about her mother's dignity and peace. Her mother had lived her entire life not knowing she was Mary Agnes Moroney. She'd died peacefully at 75, believing she was Jeanette Burchard. Let her rest in peace under that name. The living could know the truth without disturbing the dead. Arnold's relationship with the Moroney family developed slowly after the revelation. She shared photographs of her mother with them, told stories about Jeanette Burchard's life, helped them understand who Mary Agnes had become. The Moroneys welcomed Arnold as family, as they had with Mary McClellan 70 years earlier, though this time the connection was real rather than mistaken. For Arnold, accepting her new family history meant accepting that she was part of two families: the Burchard family she'd grown up in, and the Moroney family her mother had been stolen from. She was connected by blood to the Moroneys, connected by upbringing to the Burchards. Both connections were real, both were part of her identity, even though one was built on crime and deception. Luann de Vries had been researching the Mary Agnes Moroney case since the 1980s, long before DNA testing revolutionized genealogy. She was a distant relative of the Moroneys, a professional genealogist from Zeeland, West Michigan, who'd heard about the kidnapping from great-aunts in Chicago and become fascinated by the mystery. For decades, de Vries had pursued traditional genealogical research. She'd traced family trees, searched through old records, looked for adoptions in the right time period that might have been Mary Agnes under a different name. She'd contacted other Moroney descendants, compiled family histories, and built extensive family trees that documented every branch of the Moroney family. This foundational work proved crucial when genetic genealogy became available. De Vries had already mapped out the Moroney family structure, identified descendants who might be willing to provide DNA, and established relationships with family members across the country. When DNA testing services like Ancestry.com and 23andMe became popular in the 2010s, de Vries encouraged Moroney descendants to test and upload their results to databases. De Vries used DNA Painter, a sophisticated tool created by genetic genealogist Blaine T. Bettinger, to analyze DNA matches and visualize how different people were related. DNA Painter allows genealogists to map shared DNA segments, compare multiple matches, and work backward to find common ancestors. It's a powerful tool for solving complex genealogical mysteries, especially when combined with traditional family tree research. It was de Vries, using DNA Painter to analyze Moroney family DNA matches, who first noticed the name Lori Hart appearing as a relative to multiple Moroney descendants. The name didn't fit anywhere in the known family tree. De Vries couldn't figure out how Lori Hart was related to the Moroneys, but the genetic data was clear. She was definitely a relative. De Vries began researching Lori Hart using online databases and public records. She discovered that Hart's mother was Terry Arnold, and Arnold's mother was Jeanette Burchard. The timeline matched perfectly. If Jeanette Burchard had been born in 1928, she would have been exactly Mary Agnes's age. De Vries shared this information with Detective Rodriguez, and the investigation that would finally solve the case began in earnest. Without de Vries's decades of genealogical research, without her careful mapping of the Moroney family tree, without her analysis of DNA matches using DNA Painter, the Lori Hart connection might never have been noticed or understood. The Mary Agnes Moroney case demonstrated the power of combining traditional genealogical research with modern DNA analysis. Neither approach alone would have solved the case. Traditional genealogy, without DNA, couldn't definitively prove identity. DNA analysis without traditional genealogy couldn't construct the family trees needed to understand how matches were related. But together, these approaches were unstoppable. De Vries's role in solving the case also highlighted the important contributions that citizen genealogists make to cold case investigations. She wasn't a professional forensic investigator. She wasn't a law enforcement officer. She was a genealogist who cared about a family mystery and dedicated years of her life to solving it. Her work, done without pay or official authority, proved essential to bringing closure to the Moroney family. C.C. Moore's involvement in validating the Mary Agnes Moroney case findings represented the gold standard in forensic genetic genealogy. Moore, as chief genetic genealogist for Parabon Nanolabs, had been instrumental in solving hundreds of cold cases since the Golden State Killer breakthrough in 2018. Her validation of the Moroney case findings gave the Chicago Police Department the confidence to officially close the case. Moore's work in forensic genetic genealogy began long before it became a standard tool in law enforcement. She'd been a genetic genealogist, helping adoptees find their biological families for years before the technique was applied to criminal cases. When investigators arrested Joseph DeAngelo as the Golden State Killer in April of 2018, Moore immediately recognized that the same techniques used to help adoptees could revolutionize criminal investigations. Since then, Moore and her team at Parabon Nanolabs had worked on hundreds of cases. They'd identified murder victims whose bodies had been unidentified for decades. They'd identified murder suspects who'd escaped justice for generations. They'd solved rapes, kidnappings, and mysterious disappearances. The Moroney case represented one of their oldest cases, but the methodology was the same regardless of whether a case was 5 years old or 93 years old. Moore's validation process for the Moroney case involved carefully reviewing all the genetic data, checking the family tree construction, verifying the relationship calculations, and ensuring that no alternative explanations could account for the DNA matches. She looked for any errors in the genealogical research, any misinterpretations of the DNA data, any possibility that Jeanette Burchard could have been related to the Moroneys in some other way that didn't involve being Mary Agnes. Moore found no errors and no alternative explanations. The genetic evidence was solid. Terry Arnold was a first cousin to Don Moroney and other Moroney descendants of his generation. That relationship could only exist if Arnold's mother had been a sibling to Don's parent. The only Moroney sibling who disappeared was Mary Agnes. Therefore, Arnold's mother, Jeanette Burchard, had been Mary Agnes Moroney. The level of certainty in genetic genealogy identifications, when done correctly by experts like Moore, is extraordinarily high. Unlike the primitive blood tests of 1952 that had incorrectly supported the Mary McClelland identification, modern genetic genealogy analyzes hundreds of thousands of genetic markers and can calculate probabilities with mathematical precision. The chance that Terry Arnold's relationship to the Moroneys was a coincidence or error was essentially zero. Moore's public discussion of the case helped educate the public about how genetic genealogy works and why it's such a powerful tool. She explained that the technique works for old cases just as well as recent ones, as long as DNA can be obtained from family members. She emphasized that the success of genetic genealogy depends on public databases like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, where people voluntarily upload their DNA results to help find relatives. The Moroney case also illustrated an important ethical dimension of genetic genealogy. Some people have privacy concerns about law enforcement using public DNA databases to identify suspects or victims. Moore and other genetic genealogists emphasize that the technique is used only for serious unsolved crimes and missing persons cases, not for minor offenses. They also note that the technique doesn't identify specific individuals directly. Rather, it identifies relatives, and then investigators must use traditional genealogical research and detective work to narrow down suspects or identify unknown persons. In the Moroney case, there were no ethical concerns. The goal was to identify a missing person and bring closure to a family, not to prosecute a crime the kidnapper was almost certainly long dead. Everyone involved, from the Moroney family to Terry Arnold to law enforcement, wanted the truth. Genetic genealogy provided that truth in a way no other method could. The Mary Agnes Moroney case raises important questions about DNA databases, genetic privacy, and the balance between solving crimes and protecting individual rights. These questions have become increasingly relevant as genetic genealogy has become a standard tool in law enforcement. When someone submits their DNA to a service like Ancestry.com or 23andMe, they're primarily interested in learning about their ethnic heritage and finding relatives. Most people don't think about the possibility that their DNA might someday be used to identify a missing person or solve a crime, but that's exactly what happened in the Moroney case and hundreds of others. The key issue is that when you upload your DNA to a public database like GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA, you're not just revealing information about yourself, you're also revealing information about all your relatives. your parents, siblings, children, cousins, and more distant relations. Even if your relatives have never submitted their DNA to any database, your DNA can be used to identify them through genetic genealogy techniques. This creates a scenario where someone who has never consented to any DNA testing could potentially be identified as a crime suspect or victim because their third cousin uploaded DNA to a genealogy website. Some privacy advocates find this troubling, arguing that it represents a form of genetic surveillance that people haven't explicitly consented to. On the other hand, genetic genealogy has brought closure to thousands of families and justice in countless criminal cases. It's solved murders from the 1950s and 60s when the killers were elderly or dead. It's identified murder victims whose bodies had been unidentified for decades, allowing families to finally bury their loved ones. It's solved kidnapping cases like Mary Agnes Moroney's, bringing answers after generations of searching. The Moroney case specifically illustrates the positive potential of genetic genealogy. No one was harmed by the investigation. The kidnapper, almost certainly Jeanette Burchard, was already dead. The victim, Mary Agnes, was also dead, so there was no question of disrupting her life by revealing her true identity. The investigation brought only closure and answers to a family that had been searching for 93 years. Terry Arnold, whose DNA was crucial to solving the case, consented to testing and voluntarily provided her DNA. The Moroney family members who'd uploaded their DNA to genealogy databases had done so voluntarily. No one's privacy was violated. Everyone involved wanted the truth to be discovered. But other cases have been more controversial. When genetic genealogy is used to identify crime suspects, those individuals haven't consented to being identified through their relatives' DNA. Some have argued that this violates Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches. Courts have generally ruled that people have no expectation of privacy in DNA they share with relatives who voluntarily upload to public databases, but the legal framework is still evolving. Different DNA databases have taken different approaches to law enforcement access. Ancestry.com and 23andMe generally do not allow law enforcement access to their databases without warrants or court orders, and they actively resist such requests. GEDeadmatch and Family Tree DNA have been more open to law enforcement use, though both have implemented policies requiring users to explicitly opt in to allowing law enforcement matching. The debate over genetic genealogy and privacy will likely continue for years. As the technique becomes more common and more powerful, society will need to grapple with difficult questions about balancing crime-solving capabilities with genetic privacy rights. The Mary Agnes Moroney case represents the least controversial type of genetic genealogy investigation, identifying a victim and bringing closure to a family. But even in this case, complex privacy considerations existed. One thing is clear. Genetic genealogy has permanently changed cold case investigation. Techniques that were impossible in 1930 or even in 2000 are now routine. Cases that seemed permanently unsolvable can now be solved with DNA and genealogical research. The Moroney family's 93-year wait for answers would have been impossible to resolve without these modern tools. While the solution to the Mary Agnes Moroney case brought closure and answers, it also highlighted the limitations of solving very old cases. Some questions could be answered definitively. Others never would be. The genetic genealogy investigation proved that Jeanette Burchard had been Mary Agnes Moroney. That question was settled beyond any reasonable doubt. The investigation also strongly suggested that Jeanette Burchard had been the woman who called herself Julia Otis. The timeline, the location, the life circumstances, everything pointed to her as the kidnapper. But other questions remained unanswered. Why exactly did Jeanette Burchard kidnap Mary Agnes? The letters sent to the Moroneys claimed she'd suffered the deaths of her husband and baby and had a nervous breakdown. Was that true? Jeanette Burchard had lost 2 husbands within months in 1928, which was verified. But did she also lose a baby? There's no documentation of her having children before the kidnapping. But miscarriages and infant deaths weren't always well documented in that era. Was the kidnapping a crime of opportunity? Or had Jeanette Burchard been stalking vulnerable families for some time? The letters suggested careful planning, including reading social services columns to find desperate families. But was the Moroney family the first family she'd targeted? Or had there been others before? Did anyone help Jeanette Burchard with the kidnapping? The letter signed Alice Henderson claimed to be from Julia Otis's cousin, though police determined both letters were written by the same person. But was there really a cousin or friend who helped hide Mary Agnes? When the family moved to Virginia in 1934, did anyone in Virginia know the truth about Mary Agnes's identity? What about Frank Darris, the Chicago police officer Jeanette Burchard married in 1934? Did he know he was married to a kidnapper? Did he know that the child he was raising was stolen? He reportedly told Jeanette, Mary Agnes, later in life that the woman who raised her was not her natural birth mother, which suggests he knew something. But what exactly did he know, and when did he know it? These questions will never be answered. Everyone who might have known the truth is dead. Jeanette Burchard died in 2007. Frank Darris died in 1959. Mary Agnes died in 2003. There are no living witnesses to the kidnapping or its aftermath. The case also couldn't result in any prosecution. The kidnapper was dead. Even if Jeanette Burchard Darris Anderson's identity as Julia Otis could be proven beyond all doubt, she'd been dead for 16 years by the time the case was solved. Justice, in the sense of punishment for the crime, was impossible. Terry Arnold's refusal to allow exhumation of her mother's body meant that direct DNA confirmation couldn't be obtained. While the genetic genealogy evidence was sufficient for practical purposes and for the Chicago Police Department to close the case, the technical requirements for complete case closure under NamUs criteria weren't met. The case exists in a kind of limbo. Solved, but not completely closed according to bureaucratic standards. Perhaps most poignantly, the solution came too late for the people who needed it most. Michael Moroney died in 1957 without knowing what happened to his daughter. Catherine Moroney died in 1962, also without answers. They spent their final decades searching, hoping, and grieving, never learning that Mary Agnes was alive and living a good life just miles away from them. Mary Agnes herself died in 2003, 20 years before her true identity was discovered. She lived her entire 75 years as Jeanette Burchard, never knowing she was Mary Agnes Moroney, never knowing she had biological siblings searching for her, never knowing that her adoption had actually been a kidnapping that destroyed another family. If the case had been solved in 2000, Mary Agnes would still have been alive. She could have met her biological siblings. She could have learned about her parents, Michael and Catherine. She could have understood her true history. But she died 3 years too early, and that opportunity was lost forever. These limitations don't diminish the importance of solving the case. The Moroney family finally has answers. They know what happened to Mary Agnes. They know she lived a good life. They know she was loved and happy. That closure is invaluable, even if it came decades too late. But the case serves as a reminder that solving very old mysteries, while technologically possible, can never fully restore what was lost. Time has claimed too many witnesses, too many opportunities. The solution provides knowledge, but it cannot provide reunion, cannot provide justice, cannot reverse the decades of suffering the crime caused. The Mary Agnes Moroney case will be remembered as a landmark in cold case investigation, demonstrating the extraordinary power of genetic genealogy to solve mysteries that seemed permanently unsolvable. As the oldest solved kidnapping in Chicago Missing Persons Bureau history, and one of the oldest solved missing persons cases in American history, it represents the cutting edge of what's possible when modern DNA technology meets determined investigation. The case has multiple legacies. For law enforcement, it demonstrates that no case is too old to solve if genetic material from family members can be obtained. The traditional statute of limitations on investigations after which police typically stop actively working cases has been rendered obsolete by genetic genealogy. A case from 1930 can be solved just as readily as a case from 2000, as long as descendant DNA is available. This has implications for thousands of cold cases across America. Missing persons cases from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, cases that were investigated for years and then shelved when leads dried up, can now be reopened with realistic hope of resolution. Murder cases from generations ago, where the killer was never identified, can now potentially be solved. Unidentified remains that have languished in medical examiners' offices for decades can potentially be identified and returned to families. Sheriff Tom Dart's Missing Persons Project, which led to the Moroney case being assigned to Detective Rodriguez, represents a model for how law enforcement agencies can systematically work through cold cases using modern techniques. The project focused specifically on missing women, recognizing that these cases often received less attention than missing men or children. By dedicating full-time investigators to these cases and providing them with access to genetic genealogy resources, Dart's office has brought closure to multiple families. For the genetic genealogy community, the Moroney case represents a triumph of their methodology and a validation of their techniques. The case required careful analysis of DNA matches, construction of complex family trees, and integration of traditional genealogical research with cutting-edge genetic analysis. It demonstrated that genetic genealogists like C.C. Moore and dedicated amateurs like Luann DeVries are essential partners in modern cold case investigation. The case also highlights the importance of public DNA databases like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. Without people voluntarily uploading their DNA to these databases, genetic genealogy for law enforcement purposes wouldn't be possible. Every person who submits their DNA to these databases is potentially helping solve cold cases, even if they never know it. The Moroney family members who uploaded their DNA to Ancestry.com for personal genealogical interest ended up providing the key to solving their family's 93-year-old mystery. For families of missing persons, the Moroney case offers hope. If a 93-year-old kidnapping can be solved, then perhaps their loved one's disappearance can be solved too. Families who have given up hope after decades of searching may be inspired to contact cold case units, submit DNA, and request that genetic genealogy be applied to their cases. The message is clear. It's never too late for answers. The case also serves as a cautionary tale about how easy it was, in earlier eras, for children to be stolen and hidden. The infrastructure that allowed Julia Otis to kidnap Mary Agnes and raise her under a false identity for her entire life no longer exists in the same form. Modern birth certificates are harder to falsify. School enrollment requires documentation that's cross-checked with state databases. Social security numbers are issued at birth and tied to verified birth certificates. While child kidnapping still occurs, keeping a kidnapped child hidden for decades under a false identity would be far more difficult today than it was in 1930. Yet the case also reminds us that many children who went missing in earlier eras are still out there, living under false identities, possibly unaware of their true origins. Some may have died without ever knowing who they really were, like Mary Agnes. Others may still be alive, elderly now, unaware that they have families searching for them. The Moroney case suggests that many of these mysteries could be solved with genetic genealogy if the right DNA samples and genealogical research could be brought together. On May 15, 1930, 2-year-old Mary Agnes Moroney was carried out of her family's apartment by a woman calling herself Julia Otis. Catherine Moroney watched them leave, hearing her daughter's cries echoing in the stairwell. She had no way of knowing she would never see Mary Agnes again. On October 20, 2003, 75-year-old Jeanette Burchard died in Miami, Florida, believing she was the daughter of Jeanette Darris Anderson, believing her father had died when she was 2 months old, believing the life story she'd been told. She had no way of knowing that none of it was true, that her real name was Mary Agnes Moroney, that her real family had been searching for her for 73 years. On February 17, 2023, the Chicago Sun-Times revealed that these two women, Mary Agnes Moroney and Jeanette Burchard, were the same person. After 93 years, the mystery was solved. The longest unsolved kidnapping in Chicago history was finally closed. The story of Mary Agnes Moroney is ultimately a story about loss, resilience, and the passage of time. It's a story about a family that never gave up, about parents who spent their final years still searching for their missing daughter, about siblings who kept looking even though they'd never met their lost sister. It's a story about a woman who lived a good life without ever knowing her true identity, who was loved and happy even though she was stolen from her real family. It's also a story about the limitations of justice. Julia Otis, whoever she really was, got away with her crime. She was never caught, never prosecuted, never punished. She raised Mary Agnes, lived a full life, and died peacefully at an advanced age without facing consequences for destroying the Moroney family. Justice, in the traditional sense, was impossible. But there's another kind of justice in finally knowing the truth. The Moroney family spent 93 years wondering what happened to Mary Agnes. They followed false leads, experienced the heartbreak of the Mary McClellan misidentification, watched Michael and Catherine die without answers. But they never gave up. They kept Mary Agnes's case active. They submitted DNA to databases. They cooperated with investigators. And finally, they got answers. Those answers revealed that Mary Agnes had lived a good life. She'd been a nurse for over 50 years, helping terminally ill patients and their families. She'd raised 3 children who loved her. She'd had interests and passions: opera, the Miami Dolphins, her pets. She'd lived to 75, a full life by most measures. She'd never been abused or neglected. She'd been loved. This is what the Moroney family had hoped for during all those years of searching. They'd wanted to know that Mary Agnes was alive, that she was happy, that whoever had taken her had treated her well, and now they knew. The knowledge came decades too late to reunite with Mary Agnes, but it brought closure. The wound that had been open for 93 years could finally begin to heal. The case also revealed the extraordinary power of modern DNA technology combined with old-fashioned genealogical research. A mystery that had seemed permanently unsolvable, that had defeated generations of investigators, was cracked in a matter of months once genetic genealogy was applied to it. This represents hope for thousands of other cold cases, other families still searching, other mysteries still waiting to be solved. Detective Jose Rodriguez, reflecting on the case, emphasized how personally meaningful it was to solve such an old mystery. "This was a mystery that I personally just had to figure out how to solve for myself," he'd said. His dedication, combined with the expertise of genetic genealogists like C.C. Moore and Luann DeVries, the cooperation of Terry Arnold, and the persistence of the Moroney family across multiple generations, finally brought the case to resolution. Don Moroney, speaking for his family, captured the bittersweet nature of the resolution. "One of our hopes was that, when Mary was taken, that she led a good life, and she was taken care of. And she was. It wasn't the reunion they'd hoped for. It wasn't justice for the crime. It wasn't the happy ending where Mary Agnes learned her true identity and reconnected with her biological family before she died. But it was closure. It was knowledge. It was the end of 93 years of not knowing." The Mary Agnes Moroney case stands as a testament to several enduring truths about human nature and criminal investigation. It demonstrates that families never truly give up on missing loved ones, that the wound of not knowing can span generations, that each advance in technology offers new hope for old mysteries. It reveals how vulnerable children were in earlier eras, before modern documentation systems and cross-check databases, before surveillance cameras and computer networks, before DNA testing and genetic genealogy. Julia Otis was able to steal a child and hide her in plain sight for an entire lifetime, something that would be far more difficult in the modern era. The case shows the power of genetic genealogy to solve mysteries that conventional investigation could never crack. Without DNA analysis and genealogical research, Mary Agnes Moroney's fate would have remained unknown forever. Michael and Catherine Moroney died without answers because the technology to find those answers didn't exist yet. But their descendants lived to see the mystery solved, thanks to a revolution in forensic science that occurred in the 21st century. Most importantly, the case reminds us that every missing person has a story, has a family, has people who love them and search for them. Mary Agnes Moroney was stolen in 1930, but her family never forgot her. They kept searching through the Depression, through World War II, through the decades of the Cold War, through the turn of the millennium, into the 21st century. 4 generations of Moroneys kept Mary Agnes's memory alive, kept her case active, kept hoping for answers. And finally, 93 years after a well-dressed woman carried a sobbing 2-year-old out of a Chicago apartment, those answers came. Mary Agnes Moroney had lived a good life as Jeanette Burchard. She'd been loved, she'd been happy. She died peacefully at 75. She'd never known her true identity. But now her family knew what had happened to her. The longest unsolved kidnapping in Chicago history was finally solved. The story of Mary Agnes Moroney is a story about loss and resilience, about crime and consequences, about family and memory, about technology and justice. It's a story that spans 93 years, from the desperate poverty of Depression-era Chicago to the cutting-edge genetic genealogy of the 21st century. It's a story that finally, after all those years, has an ending. Mary Agnes Moroney was stolen on May 15, 1930. She died as Jeanette Burchard on October 20, 2003. Her true identity was revealed on February 17, 2023. After 93 years, she was finally found. After 93 years, the Moroney family finally had answers. After 93 years, America's longest unsolved kidnapping was solved. If you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing to Cold Case Desk. Every week, we bring you comprehensive documentaries about solved cold cases, cases that seemed impossible to crack, but were finally resolved through persistence, innovation, and the relentless pursuit of truth. These aren't just stories about crimes. They're stories about families who never gave up, investigators who refused to quit, and the power of modern science to bring closure after decades of waiting. From Victorian-era mysteries, solved through genealogy, to modern cases cracked by DNA evidence, we cover the full spectrum of cold case resolution. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new documentary. Leave a comment telling us which solved case you'd like us to cover next. And if this story moved you, Please share it with others who appreciate deep dive true crime content that respects victims and celebrates the triumph of justice, even when it arrives decades late. Remember, no case is ever truly cold. Somewhere, someone is still searching. Somewhere, answers are waiting to be found. And here at Cold Case Desk, we're committed to telling those stories of resolution, closure, and the families who finally got the answers they deserved. Thank you for watching. Until next time, this is Cold Case Desk.